There's a particular kind of silence that lives inside a house where two people have stopped trying. Not hostile, not cold, just empty, like a bus depot at 2 a.m., fluorescent lights still humming, schedules still posted on the wall, but nobody waiting for a ride. Kenneth O'Sullivan knew that silence. He'd been living inside it for years. Tuesday afternoon, 3:47 p.m. The kitchen table was covered in the usual wreckage of a life built on routine. A half-drunk mug of coffee gone lukewarm, a ballpoint pen with teeth marks on the cap, and a checkbook ledger that hadn't been balanced in 6 weeks. Ken sat hunched over the numbers, reading glasses perched low on his nose, doing the one thing that still made sense to him, making columns add up. 40 years behind the wheel of a CTA bus had wired his brain for schedules, for precision. Route 62, Archer Avenue, westbound, depart 6:12 a.m. Arrive Harlem 6:54 a.m. You could set your watch by Ken O'Sullivan. His passengers used to joke about it. The man's more reliable than the L train, old Bert from the body shop would say every morning, boarding at Pulaski with exact change and a nod. Now Ken drove a school bus, part-time, supplemental income on top of a pension that covered the mortgage and groceries but not much else. The kids called him Mr. Ken. He liked that. Kids were honest. They screamed when they were happy and cried when they were hurt and didn't pretend Tuesday was anything other than Tuesday, not like adults, not like Grace. He ran his finger down the withdrawal column for October. Mortgage, electric bill, Jewel-Osco employee discount groceries. Grace brought home dented cans of tomato sauce like trophies, gas for his truck, all predictable, all accounted for. Then his finger stopped. October 6th, ATM withdrawal, $80, cash, no memo. October 20th, ATM withdrawal, $80, cash. He flipped back to September. Same pattern. Every other Friday, $80 pulled from the joint checking like clockwork. He went further. August, same thing. July, there it was again, 6 months. Roughly $960 in cash vanished into thin air. Ken stared at the numbers. His pen hovered over the page. The refrigerator kicked on with a low rattle, and somewhere down the block a dog was barking at nothing, and the kitchen clock ticked its steady, indifferent rhythm. He told himself it was nothing. Grace probably had a reason. She always had a reason. She got home at 5:30, still wearing her Jewel-Osco vest, her name tag slightly crooked. She looked tired. She always looked tired now, but it was a different kind of tired than his, restless, like she was running from something rather than dragging toward it. "What's all this?" She nodded at the checkbook spread across the table. "Balancing the books." He kept his voice easy, neutral, the way you announce the next stop to a bus full of strangers. "Hey, Grace, what's with the cash withdrawals?" $80 every couple Fridays. She didn't flinch. That was the thing about Grace Rossi O'Sullivan. She'd grown up in a house full of loud Italian sisters who could argue about sauce recipes like it was a blood sport. She'd learned early how to keep her face perfectly still when the stakes were high. "Girls' nights with Rachel." She opened the fridge, rummaging. "You know how she is. Doesn't trust credit cards. We split everything cash. Every 2 weeks. We like our routine." She pulled out a Tupperware of leftover pasta, peeled back the lid, and sniffed it with mild suspicion. "You want me to heat this up, or are you going to interrogate me about $40 worth of Cosmos?" He almost laughed. She was good. That casual deflection, that hint of annoyance designed to make him feel like the unreasonable one. He'd seen passengers pull the same move 1,000 times, act offended when you ask to see their transfer so you stop asking. "Nah, I'll make a sandwich," he said, and that was that. She went upstairs to change. He sat with the checkbook and the silence and the dog still barking down the block, and he told himself it was nothing. Later that night, Ken stood in the basement doing laundry. He hated the basement. It smelled like damp concrete and the ghost of every winter that had ever leaked through the foundation. The washer was a 20-year-old Kenmore that shook like it was trying to break free of the floor bolts, and the dryer made a sound like a dog with something stuck in its throat. But laundry was his job, had been since retirement. Grace worked evenings now, demoted to the late shift after some dispute with her manager that she refused to discuss in detail. So Ken handled the domestic machinery. He didn't mind, it was a system. Systems made sense. He pulled Grace's work uniform from the dryer, white blouse, standard issue, slightly wrinkled. He held it up to fold it, and that's when it hit him. Cologne, not a faint trace, not the ambient smell of a crowded store. This was specific. Musky chemical sweet with that synthetic edge that cheap fragrance always carries. Stetson, maybe. Or one of those knockoff bottles they sell at the Walgreens checkout. The kind of cologne a man buys when he wants to smell like something but doesn't know what. Ken hadn't worn cologne in probably 15 years. He smelled like coffee and bus exhaust and Irish spring soap, and he was fine with that. He stood there in the basement, holding his wife's blouse to his face, and the dryer hummed its sick dog hum, and the fluorescent tube above him flickered once, twice, and he thought about nothing at all for a very long time. Then he folded the blouse, placed it on the stack, carried the basket upstairs. Grace was watching a rerun of Law and Order in the living room, feet tucked under a blanket. She didn't look up. Wednesday morning. The school parking lot at St. Casimir's was half empty, the blacktop still dark from overnight rain. Ken had finished his route early, only 12 kids today, half the usual load, some stomach bug going around, and he was leaning against the hood of Bus 19, drinking coffee from a thermos, when Anna Petrov came out the cafeteria's side door. Anna was 58, built like she could carry a refrigerator up a flight of stairs, and had the eyes of a woman who had seen every kind of human foolishness and catalogued it alphabetically. She'd worked the St. Casimir's cafeteria for 11 years, ever since her husband Victor dropped dead of a heart attack while shoveling the driveway. She made the best pierogies in the zip code and the worst small talk. Ken liked her immensely. "Cold one," she said, wiping her hands on her apron, statement, not complaint. "Getting there." Ken sipped his coffee. "Grace working a lot of late shifts these days," he said it the way you mention weather, casually. The verbal equivalent of tossing a pebble into a pond just to watch the ripples. Anna looked at him, not a glance, a look, the kind that takes inventory. "She clocked out same time as always last Friday," Anna said. Her cousin worked the Jewel-Osco deli counter. Information traveled fast in this neighborhood, hopping from kitchen to kitchen like a bird on a wire. "Saw her getting into a gray Taurus in the lot, not your truck." She said it the way she'd announced today's lunch special. "Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans. Your wife got into another man's car. Milk is 35 cents. Ken's coffee was suddenly tasteless. He swallowed it anyway. "Huh," he said. "Huh," Anna agreed. They stood in the parking lot while the wind pushed dead leaves across the blacktop, and neither of them said another word about it. That night, Ken lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Grace breathed softly beside him. She slept on her side now, facing the wall, a full 18 inches of mattress between them. He tried to remember when that gap had opened. Was it after the kids grew up? After retirement? After the anniversary? Their 35th, celebrated at Dempsey's Diner with a shared slice of pie and a Hallmark card he'd bought at the gas station on the way. She'd smiled when she read it, but the smile hadn't reached her eyes, and he hadn't noticed because he'd been thinking about the Bulls game. 35 years. You'd think that kind of time would bind two people together like rope. But rope frays, and nobody notices until the weight shifts and the whole thing comes apart. He replayed the small things. The new underwear she'd bought 2 months ago, not the sensible cotton she'd worn for decades, but something silky, dark, still tagged when he found the bag stuffed in the bathroom wastebasket. "It was on sale," she'd said, and he'd accepted it the way he accepted everything because questioning Grace required energy, and energy was something he'd stopped spending on her a long time ago. His fault, too, he knew that. He wasn't an innocent man in a crumbling marriage. He'd gone quiet years ago, retreated into his routines, his bus schedule, his garage, his father's old tools. He'd stopped asking about her day because her answers bored him, and she'd stopped asking about his because his answers were always the same. They'd become roommates who shared a mortgage and a last name and nothing else. But roommates don't lie about where they were on Friday night. Roommates don't come home smelling like another man's cologne. Friday. Ken decided to run a test. Grace was making meatloaf, her default dinner, a brick of ground beef and ketchup that had sustained their family through 3 decades of Fridays. She was humming something which was unusual. Grace didn't hum. "Hey," Ken said, setting down his beer. "You and Rachel have fun last week, the movie?" Grace didn't miss a beat. "Oh yeah, we saw that one Crash, the one that won the Oscar." God, it was intense. All these storylines weaving together, the part with the little girl and the gun, I almost lost it. She described the movie in vivid detail. The characters, the tension, the way the ending circled back on itself. She talked for 3 full minutes. She was animated, gesturing with a wooden spoon, tomato sauce on her knuckle. She was performing. Ken nodded along. Smiled in the right places. Said wow and no kidding and all the things a trusting husband says when his wife tells him about her Friday. Then after dinner, he waited until Grace was in the shower. He picked up the kitchen phone and dialed Rachel's number. It rang 4 times. Hello? Rachel sounded exhausted, double shift. Her voice had that raspy, end-of-the-day quality. Ratch, it's Ken. Just checking on that knee of yours. Grace said you've been hurting. Oh, you know, same old. The doctor says I need to lose 20 pounds like that's news. A dry laugh. Thanks for asking. Sure thing. Hey, did you enjoy the movie the other night? Grace said you two had a blast. Silence, just a beat. But Ken had spent 40 years reading silences. The silence before a passenger admits they don't have the fare. The silence before a kid confesses he missed his stop on purpose because he doesn't want to go home. Movie, Rachel said. Grace canceled, said she had a migraine. A pause, then quieter. Is she okay? The kitchen was very still. The faucet dripped its slow, patient drip. Yeah, Ken said. She's fine. Take care of that knee, Ratch. He hung up. He stood with his hand on the receiver for a long time. The shower was still running upstairs. His wife was washing the day off her body. And Ken stood in the kitchen of the house his father had built, listening to the plumbing groan through the walls, and felt something shift beneath him. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a quiet structural crack. The kind you don't hear until the foundation's already compromised. He opened another beer, sat at the table, stared at the checkbook. The numbers hadn't changed, but everything else had. 2 weeks passed. Ken said nothing. He went to work, drove bus 19 down the same streets, stopped at the same corners, waved at the same crossing guard on Archer Avenue, a heavyset woman named Dolers who wore a fluorescent vest and treated every intersection like a personal battlefield. He came home, ate dinner, watched the news, went to bed. Grace, meanwhile, was changing. It was subtle. The kind of transformation you'd miss if you weren't paying military-grade attention, and Ken was paying attention now. She'd started wearing lipstick to the grocery store. Not to work, to the grocery store. She was buying different shampoo, something that smelled like coconut and vanilla instead of the no-name brand they'd shared for years. She laughed more easily, but not at anything Ken said. She laughed at her phone, at texts she read in the bathroom, at whatever private comedy was playing inside the life she was building without him, and Ken watched, quietly. The way a bus driver watches the rearview mirror, scanning for trouble, cataloging every face, noting every movement, waiting for the moment someone does something stupid. It was a Thursday night. Meatloaf again because Thursday was meatloaf, the same way Monday was chicken and Wednesday was pasta. Their marriage ran on a meal schedule that hadn't been updated since Reagan was president. Grace set down her fork. I've been thinking. Ken looked up. Those 3 words from Grace were like hearing a smoke detector chirp, rarely good news. We should host Thanksgiving this year. He blinked. In 35 years of marriage, Grace O'Sullivan had hosted Thanksgiving exactly 4 times, and each occasion had been preceded by weeks of complaining, followed by months of referencing the ordeal as though she'd single-handedly stormed Normandy. The whole family, she continued. Rachel, Vicky, and Jake. Your brother, if he can drag himself away from that boat, make it special. She smiled. The new smile, the one that seemed practiced in a mirror. We haven't done it in years. Don't you think it'd be nice? Ken chewed slowly, swallowed. Sure, he said. Could be good. Great. She picked up her fork again, satisfied. Case closed. But Ken sat with the word special lodged in his throat like a bone. Grace didn't do special. Grace did efficient. Grace did practical. Grace did let's go to Dempsey's because the portions are big and they don't charge for extra bread. Special was a foreign language coming from a woman who had given him a Craftsman wrench for their last anniversary because it was on clearance at Sears. Something was coming. He could feel it the way a driver feels a pothole before the tire hits, a shift in the road, a vibration in the steering column. He washed the dishes and waited. The something came a week later. They were sitting in the living room. Some sitcom playing on the TV, laugh track erupting every 12 seconds like a metronome for people who couldn't figure out what was funny on their own. Grace was flipping through a women's magazine. Ken was pretending to read the Tribune sports section while actually watching his wife's reflection in the darkened window. "Oh, I meant to mention," Grace said, eyes still on the magazine, voice calibrated to a frequency of studied casualness. "There's this guy at work, Steve Wojcik. He's the security guard at the building downtown." "You know, the one who sometimes picks up shifts at the Jewel?" Ken did not know. "Well, he's got nowhere to go for Thanksgiving. His family's all out east. Philadelphia, I think. Divorced, no kids nearby." She turned a page. "It'd be Christian of us to invite him. Don't want the man eating a TV dinner alone." She said it like she was suggesting they buy a different brand of paper towels. Practical, humanitarian, wouldn't it be nice? Ken felt something cold and heavy drop through his chest and settle in his stomach like a stone tossed into a frozen lake. The ice cracked, but the surface held. "Steve," he kept his voice level. "Do I know him?" "I don't think so. Nice guy, quiet, a little lonely, honestly." She glanced up from the magazine. Her eyes were scanning his face, reading him the way he read her. Two people running reconnaissance on each other across a living room. "He brought donuts to the break room last week. Everybody likes him." Everybody likes him. Ken heard the sentence underneath the sentence. "I like him. I like him enough to bring him into our home, into our Thanksgiving. I like him enough to sit him at the table where our children learn to hold a fork." The laugh track erupted again. Ken muted the TV. "Sure," he said. "The more the merrier." Grace smiled, relieved, bright. And that smile was the confirmation, not of guilt, he already had that, but of arrogance. She wasn't just having an affair, she was displaying it. Bringing the man into the house like a trophy, parading him past the husband, daring the universe to call her bluff. It was the boldest, most reckless move she'd ever made, and she thought she was getting away with it. Ken unmuted the TV. The laugh track filled the room. He stared at the screen and saw nothing. That night, 11:43 p.m., Grace was in the shower. Her second shower of the day, which was new. Ken lay on his side of the bed, lights off, listening to the water run through the old pipes. The bedside table held the usual clutter: Grace's reading glasses, a tube of hand cream, a glass of water, and her new cell phone. The phone. That was another recent development. A prepaid thing bought at a Walgreens 3 months ago. "For emergencies," she'd said, "in case the car breaks down." Reasonable, practical, except Grace had lived 62 years without an emergency phone and the car hadn't broken down since 2001. The phone buzzed, a short mechanical vibration against the laminate surface. The screen lit up, casting a blue glow across the dark room. Ken didn't move, he didn't breathe. He let his eyes drift to the screen the way a man looks at a car wreck on the highway, not wanting to see, unable to look away. The text preview appeared for 3 seconds before the screen went dark again. "Can't wait for T-Day. This is bold, babe." The phone went black. Ken stared at the darkened screen and saw his own face reflected there, distorted, stretched, the face of a stranger trapped behind glass. He didn't touch the phone. It was password-locked, he'd noticed that weeks ago. Grace had never password-locked anything in her life. She used to leave her purse open on restaurant tables. She once gave a telemarketer their home address because, quote, "he sounded like a nice young man." Now she had passwords. Now she had secrets. Now she had a man who called her babe and was excited about sitting at Ken's table, eating Ken's turkey, drinking from the glasses Ken's mother had brought over from the old house on Kedzie Avenue. The shower stopped. The pipes shuddered. Footsteps on tile. Ken closed his eyes, breathed. She came to bed smelling like coconut and vanilla, and she fell asleep within minutes, the easy, guiltless sleep of someone who believed they had the whole game figured out. Ken lay awake until 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling, running numbers in his head. Not checkbook numbers this time, something else. A calculation that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with timing, patience, and the cold arithmetic of a man deciding exactly how, and when, to burn his entire life to the ground on his own terms. Saturday morning. Gray sky, temperature dropping, the kind of late October Chicago day that smells like rust and dead leaves and the promise of a winter that will absolutely, without mercy, kick you in the teeth. Ken drove to Holy Sepulchre Cemetery. He came here when things got heavy. Not every week, not on any schedule. Just when the noise in his head got loud enough that only the dead could drown it out. His father, Patrick O'Sullivan, was buried in Section 14, Plot 23, next to his mother, Margaret, who'd followed him into the ground 3 years later as though she'd simply gotten tired of waiting. Ken stood at the headstone. The grass was brown and brittle. Someone had left plastic flowers on a neighboring grave, bright pink, absurdly cheerful, already faded from rain. "Pop," he said. He didn't talk about Grace. He talked about buses. About the sound of the engine on the old Flyers, the diesel ones, before the CTA switched to the hybrids. About how Route 62 used to feel like a river, carrying people from one end of the city to the other, and how driving it gave you this sense that the whole world was organized into stops and schedules and things you could predict. "You always told me the straight lines were what mattered," he said to the stone. "Get up, go to work, come home, don't complicate it." A plane passed overhead low, banking toward Midway. The roar swallowed his words for a moment. "I think the line's breaking, Pop." He stood there for another 20 minutes, hands in his jacket pockets, shoulders hunched against the wind. He didn't cry. Ken O'Sullivan hadn't cried since his mother's funeral, and he wasn't about to start now. Crying was a luxury for people who hadn't spent 4 decades on a fixed route. You don't cry when the road curves unexpectedly. You adjust the wheel and keep driving. He drove home. Grace was out. "Shopping with Rachel," the note on the counter said. Ken poured himself a whiskey, the cheap stuff, the Jameson he kept above the refrigerator for nights that deserved it, and sat alone in the kitchen of his father's house. The clock ticked. The refrigerator rattled. The dog down the block started barking again. And Ken O'Sullivan began, very quietly, very carefully, to plan. Spencer Jones operated out of a second-floor office above Kim's Wash and Fold on West 35th Street in Bridgeport. The stairwell smelled like fabric softener and cigarette smoke. The door had a frosted glass panel with Jones' investigations stenciled in letters that were starting to peel, and below that, in smaller type, licensed and bonded, reasonable rates, inquiries welcome. Spencer himself was 52, built like a fire hydrant, with a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts during a budget crisis. 12 years on the beat as a Chicago PD patrolman before a blown knee and a disagreement with a precinct captain sent him into the private sector, which sounded more glamorous than it was. Most of his work was insurance fraud, filming guys on disability swinging golf clubs, occasionally a cheating spouse, occasionally a skip trace. The money was inconsistent and the coffee was always bad, but Spencer Jones was good at one thing: watching people who didn't know they were being watched. Ken found him through a recommendation from Tony DeLuca, a retired CTA driver who'd used Spencer during his own divorce back in '98. "The guys know James Bond," Tony had said over beers at McCaffrey's Tavern, "but he gets the pictures, and he doesn't run his mouth." Ken climbed the stairs on a Tuesday afternoon. Spencer was behind his desk eating a Polish sausage from a foil wrapper, a smear of mustard on his thumb. The office was small, cluttered with file boxes, and had a window that overlooked the laundromat's exhaust vent, which meant the room always carried a faint tropical warmth that didn't match the November weather outside. "Sit down," Spencer said. "You look like you need to sit down." Ken sat. He placed an envelope on the desk, $600 in cash, his entire hidden stash scraped together from small jobs over the past year. Helping Eddie Kowalski move his mother-in-law's furniture. Fixing a lawnmower for the Nuyens 3 doors down. 20 here, 40 there, tucked into an old coffee can in the garage behind a row of paint Ken's Grace never touched. "My wife," Ken said. "I think she's seeing someone." Spencer wiped the mustard off his thumb with a napkin. He didn't offer sympathy. He didn't ask, "Are you sure?" He simply opened a legal pad to a fresh page and picked up a pen. "Name, schedule, vehicle, known associates, start from the beginning." Ken told him everything. The withdrawals, the cologne, the gray Taurus, Anna's observation. Rachel's accidental confession about the canceled movie night. The phone, the text, "Can't wait for T-Day. This is bold, babe." Spencer wrote it all down in a tight, slanted hand. $80 every 2 weeks, Spencer said. "That's motel money. The places on Cicero run about 35, 40 a night. Add gas, a meal, maybe a drink beforehand. 80 sounds right." The word motel landed in the room like a slap. Ken absorbed it without flinching. "The Taurus," Spencer continued. "Did your neighbor get a plate?" "No, just the make and color." "Good enough, I'll run it. If this guy's connected to the Jewel Osco, I'll have a name by Thursday." He looked at Ken over the top of his reading glasses. "You want photos?" Ken's jaw tightened. "I want proof." "Same thing." Spencer tucked the envelope into his desk drawer without counting it. I'll be in touch. The first report came 4 days later. Spencer called from a payphone, habit from the cop days, when cell records were already a liability, and told Ken to meet him at the Dunkin' Donuts on Pulaski, the one near the expressway overpass where nobody paid attention to anybody. Spencer slid a manila folder across the orange Formica table. Inside, 6 photographs printed on glossy paper, time-stamped in the bottom corner. The first 3 showed Grace and a man at a different Dunkin' Donuts, the one on Archer, closer to the Jewel-Osco. They were sitting in a booth by the window, leaning close. The man was thick-necked, mid-40s, with a buzz cut going gray and a security guard's clip-on tie loosened at the collar. He was laughing at something Grace had said. Grace was touching his forearm. "Stephen Wojcik," Spencer said, tapping the man's face with a blunt finger. 42, divorced, 1 kid, lives in a month-to-month rental on Low Avenue in Bridgeport. Works security at the Regent Building downtown. DMV has him registered to a 2001 Ford Taurus. Gray. Ken stared at the photo, at Grace's hand on the man's arm, at the easy intimacy of 2 people who had passed far beyond the stage of casual acquaintance. "These next ones." Spencer turned the page. The 4th and 5th photos showed the gray Taurus parked in the Jewel-Osco lot, engine running. Through the windshield, 2 figures, close. The timestamp on the first read 10:17 p.m. The timestamp on the last read 11:02 p.m. 45 minutes in a parking lot after her shift, in his car. "Not damning on its own," Spencer said, stirring his coffee. "Could be talking, could be sharing a sandwich." But people who share sandwiches don't park in the back corner of the lot with the headlights off. Ken closed the folder. His coffee sat untouched, growing cold. Outside, traffic rumbled over the overpass, a constant low thunder that shook the windows. "Keep going," he said. The next morning, Ken set a small trap. He was in the kitchen, tying his shoes, when Grace came downstairs. She was wearing her hair differently, pulled back, a clip he didn't recognize. She looked rested, almost happy. He noticed these things now the way a mechanic notices a new rattle in an engine, every detail cataloged, every anomaly filed. "Hey, I might pick up an extra shift Friday," he said. "Bob Hinckley's got a doctor's appointment, could cover his afternoon route. You need the car." He watched her face. It was like watching a poker player receive a good hand, the micro-expression of relief instantly suppressed beneath a mask of indifference. "No, I'm fine," she said, too quickly. "Actually, Steve said he could give me a ride home if you're busy. It's on his way." She said Steve the way normal people say the bus or the L train. Casually, functionally. As though the man who was sleeping with her was simply a convenient piece of public infrastructure. And there it was. The confirmation wasn't in the words. It was in the smile that came after, small, private, involuntary. The smile of a woman who had just been given an unexpected free evening with her lover, delivered on a silver platter by her oblivious husband. Except the husband wasn't oblivious. The husband was keeping a ledger. "Great," Ken said. "Tell Steve I said thanks." "I will." She kissed his cheek, a dry, mechanical peck, the kind of kiss you give a piece of furniture you're fond of but planning to replace, and left for her shift. Ken stood in the kitchen, his cheek still warm from the contact, and felt absolutely nothing. The second report from Spencer was waiting in Ken's mailbox 5 days later, tucked inside a plain white envelope with no return address. Ken opened it in the garage with the door down and the single bare bulb casting its yellow jailhouse light. This time there were 8 photos. The Starlight Motor Lodge on Cicero Avenue. A 1-story concrete strip with a neon sign missing 2 letters, the kind of place that rented rooms by the hour and didn't ask questions because the answers were always the same. The parking lot was cracked asphalt, mostly empty. In the third photo, the gray Taurus was parked in front of room 7. Photos 4 through 6 were the ones that ended it. Grace and Steve walking from the car to the room. She was wearing the coat Ken had bought her 2 Christmases ago, the navy blue one from Marshall's, and Steve's hand was on the small of her back, steering her like she was something he owned. They were laughing, both of them, heads tipped back, mouths open, caught in a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy. Ken stared at his wife's face in the photograph. That laugh. He hadn't seen that laugh in years, maybe a decade. It was the laugh of a younger Grace, the Grace he'd courted at Rossi family barbecues in Bridgeport, the Grace who'd thrown her head back and called him Kenny and made him feel like the luckiest bus driver in Cook County. She was giving that laugh to another man now. In a parking lot of a motel on Cicero Avenue, under a broken neon sign next to a dumpster, the pain arrived all at once. It hit his chest like a fist, and for exactly 3 seconds, Ken O'Sullivan felt every one of his 65 years simultaneously. Every early morning, every missed holiday, every paycheck signed over to the mortgage, every quiet anniversary at Dempsey's, every night lying next to a woman who had apparently been counting the days until she could escape. 3 seconds. Then the pain went somewhere deep and cold, a place he didn't know existed inside himself, and what replaced it was something harder. Not anger. Anger was hot and heat was wasteful. This was glacial, patient, architectural. He placed the photos back in the envelope. He turned off the garage light. He walked inside, washed his hands, and made dinner: baked chicken, green beans from a can, instant mashed potatoes. When Grace came home, he asked about her day. She lied. He smiled. They ate in the comfortable silence of 35 years, and neither of them mentioned a thing. That Sunday, Ken cleaned the garage. He didn't need to. The garage was already Ken's domain. Organized, swept, tools hanging on pegboard in the exact configuration his father had established in 1971. But Ken cleaned it anyway because cleaning was thinking, and thinking was planning, and planning was the only thing keeping the glacier from cracking. In the back corner, behind a stack of paint cans and a box of Christmas lights that hadn't been hung in 5 years, he found his father's old toolbox. Red metal, dented at the corners, the latch stiff from decades of rust. He pried it open. Inside, a socket wrench set, a flathead screwdriver with a wooden handle worn smooth, a coil of wire, a carpenter's pencil, and tucked beneath a rag, a photograph. His parents, Patrick and Margaret O'Sullivan, circa 1958. Young, smiling, standing in front of this very house, the siding freshly painted, the porch railing straight. His father in a white undershirt, hair slicked, arm around his mother's waist. His mother in a print dress, squinting against the sun, looking like she'd just told a joke and was waiting for him to get it. Ken held the photo under the bare bulb. He studied his father's face, that broad, Irish face with the crooked nose and the eyes that never quite explained what was going on behind them. Patrick O'Sullivan had been a pipe fitter at the old Stockyards district. He worked. He came home. He drank a beer on the porch. He died at 68 of a heart that simply decided it had pumped enough. Had his father known this feeling, this precise surgical devastation, had Margaret ever come home smelling like someone else's cologne? Had Patrick ever stood in this garage, holding a photograph, wondering if the life he'd built was a lie? Ken would never know. Patrick O'Sullivan didn't talk about feelings. He talked about pipe gauges and the white socks and whether the gutters needed cleaning. He expressed love through silence and labor, and he expected his son to do the same. But Ken wasn't his father. Ken had been patient for 35 years, and patience without purpose was just surrender. He was done surrendering. He set the photograph on the workbench. He closed the toolbox. Then he went inside and called Spencer Jones. "The Thanksgiving dinner," Ken said. "I need you to find out everything about Steve Wojcik, not just the affair, everything, finances, work history, the divorce. What he owes, who he owes it to, all of it." "That's going to cost more than what's in the envelope," Spencer said. "I know, I'll find it." He hung up. He sat at the kitchen table and opened the checkbook. The numbers hadn't changed. Grace's secret withdrawals stared up at him, neat and consistent, a perfect paper trail of betrayal. He picked up the pen. In the margin, next to the latest $80 entry, he wrote a single word in small, precise letters: evidence. Rachel Rossi lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor of a brick 3-flat on Pershing Road, the kind of building where the radiators clanged like prisoners banging on pipes, and the hallway always smelled like someone else's dinner. She'd moved there after her husband Lou died, downsizing from the bungalow on Keeler Avenue that she could no longer afford on a home health aide salary. The apartment was clean, crowded with photographs of people who were either dead or moved away, and dominated by a television that was always on, always tuned to a game show, as though Rachel believed that if the noise stopped, the loneliness would become real. Ken arrived Saturday afternoon with a pie from Baltic Bakery on Archer Cherry, Rachel's favorite, the lattice crust already cracking from the cold. He knocked twice. Rachel answered in a housecoat and slippers, looking like a woman who hadn't expected company and wasn't sure she wanted any. "Kenny, what are you? Come in, come in. Watch the rug, it bunches." He came in. He sat at her kitchen table, which was barely large enough for two and covered with a vinyl cloth printed with faded sunflowers. She made coffee, instant, because Rachel Rossi had never met a corner she wouldn't cut, and slid a cup across to him without asking if he wanted one. "How's the knee?" he asked. "The knee is the knee. It bends when it wants to." They talked about nothing for 15 minutes. The weather, Vicky's school, Jake's freelance work or lack thereof. Ken ate a piece of pie and let the conversation drift the way Lake Michigan drifts a boat, slowly, invisibly toward wherever the current wants it to go. Then he said, "Thanksgiving's shaping up. Grace has the whole menu planned. She's even invited some guy from work." Steve something. Rachel's coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. The pause lasted 2 seconds, maybe 3, but Ken had been reading silences his entire career, and this one was deafening. It was the silence of a woman who had just heard the sound of a trap closing and was trying to decide if she was the one inside it. "Steve," Rachel repeated. She set the cup down. Her fingers left the handle slowly, reluctantly, like she was releasing a lifeline. "Yeah, she mentioned him. Nice of her. Guys got nowhere to go." Rachel looked at the sunflower tablecloth. She smoothed a wrinkle that didn't exist. Her jaw worked slightly, chewing on words she hadn't committed to saying. "Ken, how long have you known Rachel?" The directness caught her off guard. Her head came up. Their eyes met, and Ken saw the whole story written on her face, the guilt, the complicity, the uncomfortable position of a woman who loved her sister but couldn't approve of what the sister was doing. "She's making a mistake, Ken." Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper. I told her a dozen times. She doesn't listen to me. She never listens to me." "How long?" Rachel closed her eyes. "Since August. She called me one night giddy, like a teenager, told me she'd met someone who saw her, that's what she said, somebody who sees her." Rachel opened her eyes. They were wet. "I told her it was crazy. I told her she'd destroy everything. She said there wasn't anything left to destroy." The words hit Ken in a place he thought the glacier had already frozen solid. Nothing left to destroy. Was that true? Was their marriage so far gone that burning it down was just clearing dead wood? Maybe, but that didn't give her the right to light the match in secret. "She asked me to cover for her," Rachel continued. "Girls' nights, movies, I did it twice and then I stopped. I told her I wouldn't lie for her anymore." She gripped her coffee cup with both hands. "She stopped telling me things after that. I don't know the details. I don't want to." Ken nodded. He ate another bite of pie. It tasted like nothing. "Are you going to?" Rachel started. "I'm handling it." "Ken, please, she's my sister. She's foolish and she's selfish, but she's my sister." "I know." He stood, he carried his plate to the sink, washed it, dried it, put it in the rack. Old habit. "The pie's for you. Eat it before it goes stale." He let himself out. In the hallway, the radiator clanged. Someone's television was playing a commercial for a car dealership, the announcer's voice bouncing off the plaster walls with manic enthusiasm. Ken descended the stairs slowly, one hand on the railing, feeling every year of his age in his knees. Rachel had known since August. For months. His wife's sister, the woman who'd stood beside Grace at their wedding, who'd held Vicky as a newborn, who'd sat at their kitchen table 100 Sunday afternoons eating that same meatloaf, had watched the affair unfold and said nothing to him. He wasn't angry at Rachel. Not exactly. She was caught between loyalty and honesty, and blood had won. It always did in families like theirs. You protect your own even when your own is wrong. He understood that. He'd grown up in a house where problems were solved internally, where calling the cops was a last resort, where you handled your business and kept your pain behind the front door. But understanding didn't erase the isolation. The affair was Grace's betrayal. Rachel's silence was a second one, quieter, less dramatic, but just as deep. It told Ken exactly what he already suspected. In this particular war, he was alone, or so he thought. The following Wednesday, 11:15 a.m. The cafeteria at St. Casimir's was between breakfast cleanup and lunch prep, that liminal gap when the industrial kitchen smelled like a strange cocktail of steamed vegetables, bleach, And the institutional mystery, meat that Anna Petrov transformed into something kids would actually eat through sheer force of willpower and paprika. Ken didn't plan to talk. He'd come inside for coffee. The cafeteria stuff was terrible, burnt and acrid, but it was free and hot, and he didn't have to make it himself. Anna was scrubbing a steel countertop with the intensity of a woman who believed germs were a personal insult. "You look like hell," she said without looking up. "Thanks. You're welcome. Sit." He sat on a metal stool near the serving window. The fluorescent lights hummed their institutional hum. Through the window, he could see the empty cafeteria, rows of folding tables, miniature chairs, a mural of a smiling sun painted by some optimistic PTA volunteer in 1994. "Grace?" Anna asked. One word. She didn't need more. Anna Petrov communicated the way her late husband Victor had, with maximum efficiency and zero ornamental language. Ken intended to say "it's fine" or "I'm handling it" or any of the other meaningless phrases men of his generation deployed to avoid discussing their feelings. Instead, something cracked. Maybe it was the silence of the empty cafeteria. Maybe it was the smell of disinfectant, which reminded him of hospitals, which reminded him of endings. Maybe he was just exhausted from pretending. He reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out the envelope, Spencer's second report. He slid it across the counter to Anna. She dried her hands on her apron. She opened the envelope. She looked at the photos, the motel, the gray Taurus, Grace's laughing face, Steve's hand on her back, with the same expression she used when inspecting a delivery of chicken breasts for quality. Clinical. Thorough. Unimpressed by what she found, she put the photos down. She gripped Ken's forearm with a hand that was still damp from the counter and stronger than it looked. "Listen to me." Her voice was low, firm, the voice of a woman who had buried a husband, raised a son alone, and worked a cafeteria line for 11 years without once calling in sick. "You are not the fool. She is. Now you get smart. You get a lawyer, you get even." Ken looked at her hand on his arm. He looked at her face, broad, Slavic, with lines earned by hard winters and harder losses. No pity in those eyes, just practicality. Just the fierce, unsentimental empathy of someone who knows what it feels like to be left standing in an empty kitchen. "I don't know any lawyers," he said. "I do." Victor Liang's office was on the second floor of a narrow building on Wentworth Avenue, squeezed between a dim-sum restaurant and a shop that sold jade figurines and prepaid phone cards. The stairs were steep and the hallway carpet was the color of dishwater, but the nameplate on the door was polished brass, and when Ken stepped inside, the office, though cramped, was organized with a precision that Ken recognized immediately. Every file was labeled. Every pen was in its cup. The man behind the desk was the kind of person who believed in systems. Victor was 45, lean, with reading glasses that he pushed up his nose every 30 seconds, as though they were engaged in a slow, ongoing rebellion against his face. He wore a tie that was slightly too wide for current fashion but perfectly knotted, and his desk held a framed photo of 2 children and a coffee mug that said "World's OKAYESD Lawyer," which Ken suspected was a gift from someone who knew him well enough to know it was accurate. "Anna sent you," Victor said, not a question. "She did. Sit down, tell me everything. Don't leave out the parts that make you look bad." Ken told him all of it. The withdrawals, the cologne, the gray Taurus, Anna's observation, Rachel's confirmation, the prepaid phone, the text, the motel photos, the Thanksgiving invitation. All of it laid out in chronological order, the way a bus driver lays out a route, start to finish, every stop accounted for. Victor listened without interrupting. He took no notes. His eyes never left Ken's face. When Ken finished, Victor was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers, a gesture that Ken suspected he'd practiced because it made him look like a man who had heard worse and survived. "The house," Victor said. "It's in your name." "My father's house. Inherited." "My name on the deed since '89. Premarital asset. Good. She has no claim unless you voluntarily added her, which I didn't. Smart man, pension, CTA, 32 years vested. She'll make a play for a share, standard in Illinois, but marital misconduct gives us leverage to reduce her portion. Those ATM withdrawals, you said roughly $1,000 over 6 months. About that. That's dissipation of marital assets. Small amount, but it establishes a pattern. It tells a judge she was diverting shared funds to finance an affair. Combined with the photos and the timeline, we can argue she was engaged in a sustained course of financial misconduct. Victor paused. There's a phrase in family law, wasteful dissipation. It doesn't sound dramatic, but in front of the right judge, it's a hammer. Ken sat with this. The language of law was different from the language of betrayal, colder, more clinical, but it had the same precision as a bus schedule. Cause, effect, consequence. He could work with that. The Thanksgiving dinner, Ken said. She's bringing him to our house. Victor's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. She's bringing the affair partner to a family dinner in your home. She announced it like she was inviting the mailman. Victor removed his glasses, cleaned them with a cloth, and put them back on. The ritual took about 5 seconds. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted, less attorney, more strategist. That's a gift, Ken. How? Because her arrogance is your evidence. In Illinois, the concept of condonation, that's when a spouse essentially forgives the affair by continuing the marriage as normal, can complicate a divorce petition. But if she publicly introduces the affair partner to the family in your home at a holiday gathering, she's not hiding anything. She's flaunting it. That's not a gray area. That's a woman who has abandoned any pretense of discretion. He leaned forward. Let Thanksgiving happen. Let her make her announcement. Let her stand up in front of your daughter, your sister-in-law, and God and everybody and declare that this man is her boyfriend. And then, only then, you respond. With what? With the papers, already signed, already filed. You serve them at the dinner. In front of witnesses. The room was quiet. From below, the dim sum restaurant sent up a faint clatter of dishes and the muffled sound of Cantonese conversation. The Jade shop's door chimed as a customer entered. You want me to sit through Thanksgiving dinner with the man who's sleeping with my wife, Ken said. I want you to sit through Thanksgiving dinner with the man who thinks he's winning, Victor said. And then I want you to show him and her exactly how wrong he is. Ken looked at the framed photo on Victor's desk. 2 kids, maybe 8 and 10, grinning at the camera with the unearned confidence of children who hadn't yet learned that the world takes things away. Your retainer, Ken said. How much? Victor named a figure. It was exactly the amount Ken had left in the coffee can after paying Spencer. Ken paid it, every cent. He walked out of Victor's office with empty pockets and a plan, and for the first time in weeks, the glacier in his chest felt less like a burden and more like a foundation. Something to build on, something cold and solid and entirely his own. The weeks that followed were a performance. Ken O'Sullivan had never been an actor. He was a bus driver. Bus drivers don't perform, they execute. They follow the route, hit the marks, stay on schedule. But it turned out that acting and driving had more in common than he'd thought. Both required attention to the road. Both required reading the other vehicles. Both required knowing exactly when to brake. He became kinder. Not dramatically, Grace would have noticed dramatic, just a slow, subtle warming. He offered to do the dishes more often. He asked about her day with what sounded like genuine interest. He complimented the meatloaf. He even suggested they watch a movie together one night, something they hadn't done in months. Grace responded the way a plant responds to sunlight. She unfurled. She relaxed. She interpreted his warmth not as strategy but as surrender, the docile resignation of an old man who had accepted his diminished role and was grateful for the scraps of attention she occasionally threw his way. And as she relaxed, her arrogance grew visible. Small things. She left the prepaid phone on the kitchen counter now instead of tucking it into her purse. She mentioned Steve in conversation more frequently, weaving him into the domestic fabric as though he'd always been there. Steve says the Bears don't have a chance this year. Steve's trying this new diet, some Atkins thing. Steve's ex is a real piece of work. Each mention was a test. She was probing Ken's defenses, checking for reaction and finding none. And with each test passed, she grew bolder. She was a woman building a runway for departure, and she believed her husband was too blind or too beaten to see it. Ken saw everything. He noted every mention of Steve's name, every lingering phone call, every new piece of clothing purchased with cash from the joint account. He saw the slight curl of her lip when he talked about his bus route, the barely concealed impatience when he described his day. As though his life was a television show she'd long since stopped watching but couldn't be bothered to turn off. He saw, too, the way she looked at their house. Not with the warmth of someone surveying a shared home, but with the appraising eye of someone calculating what she'd take when she left. The dining room set, the silverware her mother had given them. The painting above the fireplace, a mediocre landscape of the Michigan dunes that Grace had always hated but that suddenly, Ken suspected, had acquired sentimental value now that it might be leverage. He saw all of it, and he documented nothing out loud because Victor had told him the single most important thing a betrayed spouse could learn: don't react. Record. So Ken recorded. Not literally, Illinois was a two-party consent state, and Victor had been very clear about that. But mentally, meticulously, he tracked every lie, every inconsistency, every small cruelty disguised as indifference. He kept a journal in a locked drawer of his workbench in the garage. Just dates and facts, no emotions, written in the same tight hand he'd used for logbooks during his driving years. And at night, lying next to the woman who was planning to leave him, he stared at the ceiling and felt something he hadn't expected. Not grief, not rage, not the hollow despair of a man watching his marriage disintegrate. Power. For the first time in years, maybe decades, Ken O'Sullivan was not the passive object of someone else's decisions. He was not the man who drove the same route and came home to the same silence and accepted whatever was put in front of him because that's what men like him did. He was an actor in his own story, a strategist, a man with a plan, a lawyer, a pie, and a date circled on the calendar. Thanksgiving was 4 weeks away. The turkey was already ordered from Paulina Meat Market. The table would seat 8. And somewhere in a modest apartment in Bridgeport, a man named Steve Wojcik was practicing his sweet potato casserole recipe, utterly unaware that he was walking into the most meticulously orchestrated ambush in the history of holiday dinners. Ken cleaned his father's toolbox. He oiled the hinges. He polished the latch, and he placed it on the workbench, open, waiting, like a mouth ready to speak. The house was quiet, but for the first time, the quiet had a direction. The Archer Heights branch of the Chicago Public Library smelled like carpet glue and old paper, and the particular brand of quiet desperation that hangs over any room full of people who can't afford internet at home. Ken stood at the self-service copier near the back wall, feeding documents into the scanner one page at a time, the machine whirring and clicking like a mechanical confession booth. Deed to the house. Original, dated 1971, Patrick O'Sullivan's signature in faded blue ink. Transferred to Kenneth O'Sullivan, 1989, upon his father's death. Grace's name appeared nowhere on it. 35 years of marriage, and she'd never once asked to be added. At the time, Ken thought it was trust. Now he understood it was indifference. She hadn't cared about the house because she hadn't planned on needing it. Pension statements, 32 years with the CTA. The monthly amount wasn't impressive, no bus driver retires rich, but it was steady, reliable, the financial equivalent of Route 62 itself. Every month, same number, same deposit. The kind of money Grace had taken for granted the way you take gravity for granted. It's just there, until someone files a petition to redistribute it. Bank records. 6 months of statements from First Midwest, printed on that thin, almost translucent paper that banks use because they know you're not supposed to enjoy reading them. Ken had highlighted the ATM withdrawals in yellow marker, every other Friday $80, regular as a heartbeat, 12 entries, $960, not a fortune, but in Victor's words, a pattern. Sir. You done with the machine? Ken turned. A teenage girl with a backpack and a bored expression was waiting behind him, holding a textbook. 1 more minute. He fed the last page through. The scanner hummed. He emailed the batch to Victor's office address, a Gmail account, because even lawyers in Chinatown had moved past fax machines and collected his originals. He tucked them into a manila folder. The folder went into a canvas grocery bag from Jewel-Osco, which struck him as grimly appropriate. He walked past the reference desk, past the children's section where a librarian was reading to a circle of toddlers, past a man sleeping in a chair with a newspaper over his face, and out into the November air. The sky was the color of a dirty nickel. Wind cut down Archer Avenue like it had somewhere to be. Ken zipped his jacket and walked to his truck, carrying 35 years of financial history in a grocery bag, and felt like a man smuggling weapons across a border. Which, in a way, he was. Victor called that evening. Got everything. The deed is clean, premarital, never modified, never co-signed. She can't touch it. Ken was in the garage, the phone pressed to his ear, the door closed. Grace was upstairs watching television. Through the ceiling, he could hear the muffled laugh track of whatever sitcom was keeping her company. 2 floors and a lifetime between them. The pension's trickier, Victor continued. Illinois is an equitable distribution state. She's entitled to a marital share, basically the portion that accrued during the marriage. That's significant, but here's where the misconduct argument earns its keep. If we demonstrate sustained infidelity combined with financial dissipation, a judge has discretion to reduce her share. Not eliminate, reduce. How much are we talking? Depends on the judge. Could be 10% reduction, could be more. The photos from the motel help. The ATM withdrawals help. But the Thanksgiving stunt, if she actually introduces this man as her boyfriend in front of family, that's the piece that turns this from a standard dissolution into something a judge remembers. Ken leaned against his workbench. The bare bulb overhead cast its yellow light across his father's tools, all hanging in their assigned places on the pegboard. Socket wrenches, largest to smallest, left to right. Phillips heads in one row, flatheads in another. A system, a logic, the kind of order that men build when the rest of their lives won't cooperate. She's going to do it, Ken said. I heard her on the phone. She called me clueless. Good, good. The more confident she is, the less careful she'll be. Overconfidence is the best thing that can happen to our case. A pause, papers shuffling. One more thing, the Pi Spencer. I need him to run a full background on the boyfriend, not just the affair, everything. Employment history, credit, child support obligations. If this man has liabilities, they become part of our narrative. What narrative? That your wife isn't just having an affair. She's investing marital resources, time, money, emotional energy into a man who is himself a financial liability. That's not a romance, that's a bad investment. And judges in Cook County don't like bad investments. Ken almost smiled, almost. I'll call Spencer tomorrow. Good, and Ken, keep being kind to her. Keep being the husband she thinks she's outsmarting. The wider the gap between who she thinks you are and who you actually are, the harder the fall. The line went dead. Ken hung up the phone and stood in the garage, listening to the furnace tick through the wall and thought about gaps. The gap between Grace's version of their marriage and the truth. The gap between the man she thought she'd married and the man she was about to meet in a courtroom. The gap between the life she was planning and the one that was actually coming. He turned off the light and went inside. Grace was asleep on the couch, the television still on, her prepaid phone resting on her stomach like a small, sleeping animal. He covered her with the Afghan his mother had crocheted in 1973, turned off the TV, and went to bed. Spencer's report on Steve Wojcik arrived 3 days later. They met at the same Dunkin' Donuts on Pulaski, same orange Formica table, same bad coffee. Spencer slid the folder across without ceremony. Your wife's boyfriend is a real prize, Spencer said, unwrapping a breakfast sandwich with the methodical care of a man who treated fast food as a sacrament. Stephen Allen Wojcik, 42, divorced in 2003 from Alinda Wojcik, née Kowalczyk. 1 kid, a daughter, 14, lives with the mother in Berwyn. Ken opened the folder. Inside, a printout of court records, a credit report, and Spencer's handwritten notes in that same tight, slanted script. Child support, Spencer continued between bites. Ordered at $600 a month. He's 4 months behind. That's $2,400 in arrears. The ex-wife's lawyer filed a motion for contempt back in September. Hearings in January. So he owes money he doesn't have. He owes money he'll never have. Look at the employment record. Spencer tapped the second page. Last 5 years, security guard at Regent Building downtown, current. Before that, night security at a parking garage on State Street. Before that, warehouse work in Cicero. Before that, a stint at a car wash. The man's resume reads like a tour of dead-end jobs. He doesn't climb ladders. He moves sideways. Ken studied the credit report. The numbers were grim. 2 maxed-out credit cards, a defaulted auto loan, and rent payments that consumed 60% of his take-home. Steve Wojcik was not a man with a plan. He was a man treading water in a pool that was slowly draining. His apartment, Spencer added, month-to-month lease on Low Avenue. No furniture to speak of, based on what I could see through the window. A couch, a TV, a card table with 2 folding chairs. The man lives like a college kid who gave up. Ken closed the folder. He looked out the window at the traffic on Pulaski, the buses grinding past, the delivery trucks, the ordinary machinery of a city that didn't care about any of this. "He's nobody," Ken said. "He's worse than nobody. He's a liability, and your wife picked him." The words landed with a weight that surprised Ken. Not because they were cruel, Spencer dealt in facts, not cruelty, but because they illuminated something Ken hadn't fully processed. Grace hadn't left him for a better man. She hadn't found someone richer, smarter, more ambitious. She'd found a 42-year-old security guard who couldn't make his child support payments and ate dinner at a card table, which meant the affair wasn't about Steve. It was about not Ken. Any warm body that wasn't her husband would have done. Steve was just the one who happened to be standing nearby when Grace decided she was finished. That realization should have hurt. Instead, it simplified things. This wasn't a love story. It was an escape attempt. And escape attempts, in Ken's experience, usually ended with someone getting caught. The lunch with Vicky happened on a Thursday at a diner on Western Avenue that they both pretended to like because it was halfway between her school and his bus depot. Neutral ground. The kind of place with sticky menus and a waitress who called everyone hun, and coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Ford administration. Vicky looked tired. Not the tired of a long day, the tired of a long year. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail that had given up trying to be neat, and she was wearing a cardigan with a small stain on the sleeve that she kept tugging down to cover. Third-grade teachers don't get rich. Third-grade teachers married to struggling freelance designers get even less rich. Ken could see the strain in her face, the tightness around her eyes, the way she gripped her coffee cup with both hands like it was the only warm thing in her life. "Dad," she said it the way she always did, half greeting, half accusation. Vicky had inherited her mother's directness and her father's stubbornness, which meant every conversation between them felt like 2 trains approaching each other on the same track. "Hey, kiddo, how's the class?" "Exhausting. I've got a kid who eats glue and a kid who cries every time I say the word Wednesday. Don't ask me why Wednesday." She managed a thin smile. "How are you?" "I'm fine." "You're not fine, Mom says." She stopped, recalibrated, tried again. "Mom's worried about you." Ken set down his coffee. "Is she?" "She says you're checked out, that you don't talk to her, that you live in the past." Vicky's eyes searched his face. "She says you're more interested in that garage than in your own marriage." There it was, Grace's preemptive strike. She'd been building her case with their daughter, painting Ken as the emotionally absent husband, the man who retreated into his tools and his routines while his wife withered from neglect. It was a smart move. It gave Grace a narrative. I didn't leave because I was selfish. I left because he was already gone. Ken could have fought it. He could have pulled out the photos, told Vicky everything, blown the whole thing open right there between the laminated menus and the ketchup bottles. Victor's voice echoed in his head. Let Thanksgiving happen. So instead of defending himself, Ken did something harder. He let the accusation stand. "Maybe she's right," he said quietly. "Maybe I haven't been paying enough attention." He looked down at his hands, big hands, rough from decades of steering wheels and socket wrenches, the knuckles starting to swell with the arthritis that was slowly claiming them. He looked sad, and the sadness was real, not performed, not tactical. He was sad. Sad that his daughter was sitting across from him repeating lies she'd been told by a mother she still trusted, and he couldn't correct her without destroying everything. Vicky reached across the table and touched his wrist. "Dad, is something going on? Something you're not telling me?" "No, sweetheart, just getting old." He patted her hand. "Tell me about Jake. How's the design work?" She let him change the subject, but her eyes stayed worried. The seed was planted. Not a seed of suspicion, a seed of doubt. Doubt about the story her mother was selling. Doubt that would grow quietly in the weeks to come until Thanksgiving pulled it out by the roots and showed her what was really underneath. They ate their sandwiches. They talked about Jake's latest temp job, data entry at an insurance office, soul-crushing, but it paid. They talked about Vicky's students, about the glue eater, about the Wednesday crier. They didn't talk about Grace. When Ken hugged her goodbye in the parking lot, she held on a beat too long. She could feel it, something shifting beneath the surface. She just didn't know what yet. The coffee shop was called Grounded. A small place on Halsted exposed brick mismatched furniture, the kind of establishment that sold oat milk lattes and played music that sounded like someone crying in a forest. Not Ken's scene. But it was where Grace and Steve went on Wednesdays, according to Spencer's surveillance log, and Ken had developed a habit of sitting at the counter on Thursday mornings, after his bus route, drinking a plain black coffee and watching the staff. The barista's name was Mike. 23, wiry, with a shaved head and wire-rimmed glasses and the permanently alert expression of someone who was writing a novel in his head at all times. He moved behind the counter with a nervous, caffeinated energy, remembering orders, wiping surfaces, making small talk with regulars. He noticed things. Ken could tell. The kid had observer's eyes, the same quality Anna had, the same quality Spencer had. The ability to see what most people were too busy or too polite to notice. Ken didn't know what Mike knew. He didn't approach him. He simply came in, ordered his coffee, sat at the counter, read the Tribune, and left. A harmless old man. Background noise. On the third Thursday, Mike broke the pattern. Ken was folding his newspaper, preparing to leave, when a fresh coffee appeared at his elbow. He hadn't ordered a refill. "On the house," Mike said. He slid a napkin under the cup. Then he moved down the counter to help another customer, smooth as a card dealer. Ken looked at the napkin. Written in blue pen in small, careful letters, "They come in Wednesdays. She calls him Stevie." He never tips. Ken stared at the words. The coffee shop hummed around him, the espresso machine hissing, a laptop keyboard clicking, someone's phone playing a podcast about true crime at a volume that suggested the listener had forgotten they weren't alone. He looked up. Mike was making a latte, his back turned, but Ken caught his reflection in the chrome of the espresso machine. The kid's eyes flicked to the mirror, met Ken's, held for half a second. Then Mike went back to his latte and Ken folded the napkin, tucked it into his jacket pocket and left a $5 tip on the counter. He never tips. A small detail. The kind of thing that shouldn't matter. But Ken had spent 40 years observing people from the driver's seat of a CTA bus, and he knew that the small details were the ones that told you everything. A man who doesn't tip is a man who doesn't see the people serving him. A man who doesn't see the people serving him is a man who takes without thinking. And a man who takes without thinking will eventually take something that isn't his. Steve Wojcik never tipped. Grace O'Sullivan was something he'd taken. Ken drove home with the napkin in his pocket and the $5 tip on his conscience, not because it was too much, but because it felt like paying a witness, and witnesses deserved more than money. They deserved to know their observations mattered. Friday afternoon, Victor's office. The dim sum restaurant below was in full lunch rush, and the ceiling vibrated faintly with the clatter of carts and conversation. The smell of steamed pork buns seeped up through the floorboards, incongruously comforting. Victor had the divorce petition spread across his desk. 12 pages, double-spaced, dense with legal language that turned Ken's marriage into a series of numbered paragraphs and subsections. In re, the marriage of Kenneth Patrick O'Sullivan and Grace Marie O'Sullivan, née Rossi. There was something violent about seeing it written down, the clinical reduction of 35 years into petitioner and respondent. "Walk me through it," Ken said. Victor adjusted his glasses, the habitual upward push that Ken had come to recognize as Victor's version of clearing his throat. Section 1, grounds. We're citing irreconcilable differences as the primary cause, with a secondary allegation of marital misconduct. Illinois doesn't require fault grounds for dissolution, but the misconduct allegation allows us to argue for inequitable distribution of assets. Basically, we're saying the marriage failed and she made it worse. The photos, referenced in Section 3, we're not attaching them to the petition itself. That comes during discovery if she contests. But the language makes clear we have documentary evidence of an extramarital relationship with a named individual. Victor tapped a paragraph. Stephen Allen Wojcik. He's listed as a correspondent. That means he gets served too, separately. Ken thought about Steve receiving legal papers in his card table apartment on Low Avenue, opening the envelope with those thick security guard hands. Reading his own name in a document that described him as the man who destroyed someone else's marriage. Section 4 is the financial piece, Victor continued. Wasteful dissipation of marital assets. We list the ATM withdrawals, approximate total, $960 over 6 months, and characterized them as funds diverted from the marital estate to finance the affair. Motel expenses, meals, transportation were also flagging her pattern of deception, the girl's night cover story, the prepaid phone purchased with marital funds. She bought the phone with cash from the account. Did she use the debit card or the ATM? Ken thought. Debit card, I saw it on the statement. Walgreens, $39.99. Perfect, that's traceable. A prepaid phone purchased with marital funds, used exclusively to conduct an affair. That's dissipation. Small dollar amounts, but the pattern matters more than the total. Victor turned to the last page. Section 7, Proposed Distribution. You keep the house, premarital asset, no contest there. We propose a reduced share of the pension based on misconduct. We ask that she bear responsibility for her own legal fees and for the dissipated funds, and we request that any shared personal property be divided according to standard equitable principles, with the caveat that items of sentimental value originating from your family remain with you. My mother's silverware, listed in the appendix. Ken looked at the petition. 12 pages. The entire architecture of his revenge translated into language that a judge could act on. It was clean, surgical, completely devoid of emotion, and that Ken realized was exactly what made it devastating. Emotion could be argued with, dismissed, pitied. Numbers couldn't, dates couldn't, time-stamped photographs couldn't. The plan for service, Ken said. Thanksgiving. Victor leaned back. Here's how it works. I'll have the papers filed with the Circuit Court of Cook County the morning of Thanksgiving. That makes it official, the case exists, the clock starts. Then at the dinner when she makes her announcement, you come in. I come in with copies, one for her, one for the boyfriend, hand-delivered in front of witnesses. Victor paused. It's theatrical. I won't pretend otherwise. A process server at her workplace on Monday morning would be legally identical. But you want impact. You want her to understand that the same audience she chose for her announcement is the audience that watches her receive the consequences. Is it legal? Service of process can occur anywhere, anytime. There's no law against being served divorce papers at Thanksgiving dinner. It's unusual, but not illegal. Ken nodded. He stared at the signature line at the bottom of the last page. A thin black line waiting for ink. Below it printed, Kenneth Patrick O'Sullivan, petitioner. He didn't sign, not yet. I need a few more days, he said. Victor nodded. Take them. But the filing has to happen the morning of, so I need your signature by Wednesday night at the latest. Ken stood. He shook Victor's hand, a firm grip, calloused palm, the handshake of a man who had worked with his hands his entire life and respected anyone else who did the same. Victor's grip was lighter but steady, a partnership of different strengths. Wednesday, Ken said. He walked down the steep stairs, past the Jade shop into the November cold. The sky was already darkening at 4 in the afternoon, the way Chicago skies do in late fall, not gradually, but all at once, like someone dimming the lights on a stage. Thanksgiving was 12 days away. Grace bought a dress. Not from Jewel Osco's sad little clothing rack, where she usually picked up clearance blouses with the enthusiasm of a woman selecting produce. This was from a real store, a boutique on Cermak Road that Ken had never heard of, a place with a name that ended in an apostrophe and sold things that required dry cleaning. She paid cash. $80 pulled from the joint account on Friday like clockwork, except this time she didn't even bother with the ATM. She wrote a check and marked it personal. Ken found the receipt in her coat pocket while hanging it up. Not snooping, just habit. 35 years of marriage builds routines that operate below conscious thought. You hang up a coat, you check the pockets, the way you check the rearview before changing lanes. The receipt was folded once. La Femme Boutique. One dress, burgundy, SZ12, $78.50 plus tax. A burgundy dress, for Thanksgiving, for the dinner where she planned to introduce her boyfriend to her family. She was dressing for the occasion the way a general dresses for a victory parade, the battle already won in her mind, the formality just theater. Ken put the receipt back, hung up the coat, said nothing. That evening, Grace was at the kitchen table with a legal pad, writing in the looping, oversized cursive she'd used since high school, the Thanksgiving menu. Ken could read it from across the room. Her handwriting had never learned the concept of discretion. Turkey, Ken Brines, his dad's recipe. Mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce, canned, nobody likes homemade. Dinner rolls, pumpkin pie, Jewel Bakery, Steve's sweet potato casserole, that last item. Written casually, slotted between the pie and a notation about napkins, as though a man named Steve and his casserole were just another ingredient in the holidays recipe. As though he belonged there. "Steve's bringing his famous sweet potato casserole," Grace announced, not looking up from the pad. "He makes it with marshmallows on top, the big ones, not the mini." "Sounds great." Ken was drying a dish. He set it in the rack with careful precision. "I'm sure it'll be a Thanksgiving we'll never forget." Grace glanced up. Something flickered across her face, not suspicion exactly, but a momentary alertness, the way a deer lifts its head at a sound it can't identify. Then it passed. She went back to her list. "I was thinking we should use the good china," she said. "Your mother's set?" Ken's hands went still on the dish towel. His mother's china. The Noritake set Margaret O'Sullivan had received as a wedding gift in 1955 and used exactly twice a year, Easter and Christmas, treating each plate like a holy relic. The set had come to Ken after her death, along with the house and the toolbox and the accumulated weight of everything his parents had built and protected. Grace had always considered it too fussy, too delicate, a pain to wash. She hadn't suggested using it in at least a decade. Now she wanted it on the table, for him, for Steve and his marshmallow casserole. "Sure," Ken said. His voice was even. "The good china." He finished drying the dish. He folded the towel. He walked to the garage, closed the door, and stood in the dark for 90 seconds, breathing through his nose, his fists clenched at his sides, until the urge to walk back into the kitchen and tell his wife exactly what he knew and exactly what was coming had passed. Then he turned on the light and called Anna. "She wants to use my mother's china." Anna's voice came through the phone flat and unsurprised. "Of course she does. She's putting on a show. She wants everything to look perfect when she drops the bomb." "It's my mother's china, Anna. I know whose china it is, and it'll still be yours after Thursday. Along with the house and the pension and your dignity. Focus." Anna Petrov did not do gentle. She did direct. She did practical. She did the verbal equivalent of grabbing a man by the collar and shaking him until the self-pity fell out. "Now, the house, what do you need help with?" They spent 20 minutes on logistics. Anna would arrive early Thursday, ostensibly as Ken's guest, a neighborly invitation, nothing suspicious. She'd help with the food preparation and provide a steady presence. More importantly, she'd be a witness. "Victor's going to park on the street," Ken said. "He'll wait in his car until I give the signal." "What signal?" "I'll go to the front door, open it. He comes in." Very dramatic. She wanted an audience. Anna was quiet for a moment. Through the phone, Ken could hear the faint sound of her television, news probably. Anna watched the 10 o'clock news every night the way other people said prayers. A ritual of bearing witness to the world's problems so her own felt smaller. "Ken, are you sure about the timing? Doing it at the dinner." "She's going to stand up in front of our daughter and announce that she has a boyfriend. In my house, at my table, using my mother's china." He paused. "Yes, I'm sure. Then I'll bring my pierogi casserole. Somebody should bring food that's actually worth eating." She hung up. Ken stood in the garage, phone in hand, and felt the strange, contradictory sensation of being simultaneously devastated and prepared. Like a man who sees the storm on the radar and has already boarded up the windows. The wind is still coming, but the nails are in. Tuesday, 2 days before Thanksgiving. Ken came home early from the bus depot, a half-day, the kids released before lunch for the holiday week, the school emptying out with the giddy, desperate energy of children who smell freedom. The house was supposed to be empty. Grace's shift at Jewel Osco started at 2. It was 12:40. But as Ken came through the back door into the kitchen, hanging his jacket on the hook by the refrigerator, he heard it. A voice, upstairs, Grace's voice, but not the Grace he knew. Not the tired, irritable, middle-aged Grace who sighed when he asked what was for dinner and rolled her eyes when he talked about the bus route. This was a different voice entirely. Lighter, higher. A giggle that Ken hadn't heard in so long he'd forgotten it existed, the way you forget the sound of a song you used to love until you hear it playing from a stranger's window. He stood at the bottom of the stairs. The bedroom door was ajar. Not open, not closed. Ajar. The precise distance that says, "I didn't think anyone would be home." "I know, right?" Grace's voice drifted down the stairs, carried by the old house's acoustics, plaster walls, hardwood floors, architecture that was never designed for secrets. After Thursday, things will be different. We can start planning. He's so clueless, it's almost sad. A pause, listening to the voice on the other end. Then, no, he won't make a scene. That's not Kenny. He'll just accept it. He accepts everything. That's his whole thing. Another giggle. I'm wearing the new dress. You're going to lose it when you see me. Ken stood at the bottom of the stairs with his hand on the banister, the same banister his father had installed in 1972, replacing the original that had cracked during a party, and listened to his wife describe him to her lover. Clueless, accepts everything. That's his whole thing. She wasn't wrong. That had been his thing. For 35 years, acceptance had been his default setting, accept the late shifts, accept the fading intimacy, accept the silence. Accept the meatloaf on Thursday and the quiet on Sunday and the slow, invisible erosion of a marriage that had stopped being a partnership and become a tenancy arrangement. But acceptance, Ken had learned in the past 6 weeks, was not the same thing as surrender. Acceptance was what you did when you had no other options. Strategy was what you did when you finally found one. He released the banister. He walked back through the kitchen, silent on the linoleum, picked up his jacket, and left through the back door. He sat in his truck in the driveway for 10 minutes, engine off, watching the house. The bedroom window. The curtain was drawn. At 1:15, Grace came out the front door, purse over her shoulder, the car keys jingling in her hand. She was humming. That hum again, the hum of a woman who believed her plan was flawless, her husband was harmless, and the future was a red carpet unrolling specifically for her. She drove away. Ken watched the car until it turned the corner onto Archer. Then he started his truck and drove to Victor's office. The signature. Victor had the petition ready, spread open to the last page, the black line waiting. A pen, not a ballpoint, a proper fountain pen with blue-black ink, lay beside it. Victor's one indulgence Ken had noticed. Everything else in the office was practical and cheap, but the pen was heavy silver engraved with initials that weren't Victor's. A mentor's gift, maybe, a father's. Before you sign, Victor said, I want you to understand what this means. Once I file this, it's real. It's public record. There's no taking it back without formally withdrawing the petition, which creates its own complications. You're asking a court to dissolve your marriage on grounds that include adultery and financial misconduct. Your wife will be served. Her companion will be notified as a named party. This will be the worst day of her life. Ken looked at Victor. She's planning to announce her boyfriend at Thanksgiving dinner, in front of our daughter, using my dead mother's china. I think she's already decided it's going to be the worst day of someone's life. She just picked the wrong someone. Victor held his gaze for a moment. Then he slid the pen across the desk. Ken picked it up, heavier than expected. The nib was fine, precise, the kind of instrument that demanded you mean what you wrote. He placed the tip on the line. The ink touched the paper, and for one heartbeat, everything stopped. The traffic on Wentworth Avenue went silent. The dim sum restaurant below ceased its clattering. The whole building held its breath. He signed, Kenneth Patrick O'Sullivan. The letters were steady, no tremor. No hesitation. The handwriting of a man who had spent 40 years filling in logbooks, recording departure times and arrival times and the number of passengers carried, each entry a small act of accountability. This was just another entry. Departure, 35 years of marriage. Arrival, whatever came next. Victor blotted the signature with a square of felt. I'll file Thursday morning. The clerk's office opens at 8:30. Papers will be in the system before your turkey comes out of the oven. And the service. I'll have copies in my briefcase. One for Grace, one for Wojcik. I'll park on your street by noon. When you open the front door, I come in. He paused. You're sure you don't want a process server, someone neutral? I want her to see a face she doesn't recognize. I want her to realize I found a lawyer and she didn't even know I was looking. Victor nodded slowly. That's effective. He placed the signed petition in a folder, the folder in his briefcase, the briefcase on the floor beside his desk. Locked the clasp, 2 clicks, precise as a judge's gavel. Ken, one more thing. Thursday is going to be ugly. People will cry. People will scream. Your daughter will be there. Are you prepared for that? Ken thought of Vicky. Her tired eyes, her stained cardigan, her trust in a mother who was using her as a shield. He thought of the lunch at the diner, the story Grace had planted. Your father is checked out. Your father lives in the past. He thought of Vicky reaching across the table to touch his wrist, the worry in her face, the seed of doubt he'd seen take root. "Vicky's going to be hurt," Ken said, "but she's going to be hurt either way. Grace is going to announce a boyfriend. Vicky was going to find out her mother's been lying. The only question is whether the truth comes from Grace's version, where I'm the sad, oblivious fool who gets left behind, or from mine, where I'm the man who stood up." Victor said nothing. He didn't need to. The logic was clean, and they both knew it. Ken shook his hand, walked down the stairs, stepped into the evening cold. Thanksgiving was 48 hours away. Wednesday night. The night before Thanksgiving. The house on Archer Heights was more alive than it had been in years, and Ken hated every minute of it. Grace had transformed the dining room. Tablecloth, white linen, ironed, a relic from some anniversary neither of them remembered. The Noritake china, each plate handled with a reverence Grace had never shown while Margaret O'Sullivan was alive to witness it. Crystal glasses they'd received as a wedding gift and used maybe 5 times in 35 years. Candles, actual candles, tapered in brass holders Ken didn't recognize. She must have bought them. Another cash withdrawal, another prop for the performance. "What do you think?" Grace stood in the dining room doorway, hands on her hips, surveying her work with the satisfaction of a set designer on opening night. She was wearing an old sweater and jeans, her hair in a clip, but there was a brightness to her that Ken recognized from decades ago, the Grace who'd hosted their first Christmas in this house, the Grace who'd arranged flowers for Vicky's baptism. Energy. Purpose. The terrible vitality of a woman who believed she was about to start her real life. "Looks beautiful," Ken said. He meant it. The table was beautiful. The china gleamed. The glasses caught the overhead light and threw tiny rainbows on the ceiling. It looked like a table set for a celebration. It was, just not the one she imagined. "I said 8 places," Grace said. "You, me, Vicky, Jake, Rachel, Anna, you said she's coming, right? Steve, and 1 extra in case your brother surprises us." "He won't. His back's out again." "7 then." She removed a place setting with efficient hands. "7 is fine. It's a good number." Ken watched her carry the extra plate to the kitchen. She was humming that hum. He'd been keeping track. She hummed on days she talked to Steve and didn't hum on days she didn't. Today was a humming day. "I'm going to start the brine," he said. "Already, it's only 8. Pop's recipe needs at least 12 hours. The longer it sits, the better the bird." Grace shrugged. "Your department." She disappeared upstairs. Ken went to the kitchen. He pulled the turkey from the refrigerator. A 14-pounder from Paulina Meat Market, purchased with his own money, the one expenditure for this dinner he'd insisted on controlling. He filled the stock pot with water, added salt, sugar, bay leaves, peppercorns, allspice. His father's recipe, memorized, never written down. Patrick O'Sullivan had brined turkeys the same way every year from 1965 until the Thanksgiving before he died, and Ken had stood beside him in this same kitchen, watching the same hands measure the same ingredients with the same wordless precision. He submerged the turkey, covered the pot, placed it in the garage where the cold would keep it overnight, a Chicago trick using November as a refrigerator. Back inside, he washed his hands, dried them on the dish towel, looked at the dining room through the kitchen doorway. The table set and waiting, the candles unlit, the empty chairs. He picked up the phone and called Victor. "Tomorrow morning, 8:30 filing. I'll be at the clerk's office when the doors open. On your street by noon. Gray sedan. I'll park 3 houses east." "Gray sedan," Ken repeated. "Not a Taurus, I hope." A beat of silence. Then Victor laughed, a short, surprised sound, the first genuine laugh Ken had heard from the man. "A Camry. I'll make sure it's a Camry." "Good. See you tomorrow." He hung up. The house settled into its nighttime sounds. The furnace cycling, the floorboards contracting in the cold, the faint creak of Grace moving around upstairs. The sounds of a house that had held a family for 50 years and was about to hold something very different. Ken turned off the kitchen light. In the dark, the dining room glowed faintly, the streetlight through the curtains catching the edge of the crystal, the white tablecloth, the brass candle holders. It looked for a moment like an altar. He went to bed. Grace was already asleep, or pretending to be. He lay on his side of the mattress, his side, the left, always the left, for 35 years the left, and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow, he closed his eyes. Sleep came faster than expected, dark and dreamless, the sleep of a man who has made his decision and is no longer burdened by the making of it. 5:14 a.m. The alarm didn't go off because Ken hadn't set one. His body woke him the way it always did, internal clock, the driver's clock, calibrated by 4 decades of 5 a.m. starts. He lay still for 10 seconds listening. Grace's breathing slow and rhythmic, the furnace humming, a garbage truck grinding somewhere on Archer, the early crew running the holiday route. He got up. Dressed in the dark, khakis, a button-down shirt, the one nice sweater Vicky had given him last Christmas. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror. The face that looked back was 65 years old, lined with eyes that had seen 100,000 bus stops and one betrayal. It was not a handsome face, but it was a steady one. He went downstairs, made coffee, pulled the turkey from the garage, cold, firm, the brine having done its work overnight. He patted it dry with paper towels, rubbed it with butter and herbs, and placed it in the roasting pan. The oven was preheated to 325. The bird went in at 6:10. The kitchen filled with warmth. The smell of butter and rosemary crept into the hallways, up the stairs, into the rooms. It was the smell of every Thanksgiving Ken could remember, his mother's kitchen, this kitchen, the constant through all the years and all the changes. Some things survive everything. He set a timer. 14-pound bird, roughly 15 minutes per pound, 3.5 hours. The turkey would be done by 9:45, give or take. He'd let it rest for 30 minutes. Carve by 10:15, dinner at noon. Victor would file the papers at 8:30. The case would exist in the system by 9:00. By the time Grace's turkey was golden and resting on the counter, Grace's marriage would be officially under legal dissolution. Ken poured his coffee and sat at the kitchen table. Through the window, the sky was lightening, not sunrise, not yet, but the slow gray lift of a November dawn, the clouds thinning from black to charcoal to the color of old pewter. A cardinal sat on the fence post, bright red against the brown yard, impossibly vivid, like a drop of blood on parchment. He drank his coffee. He listened to the oven tick. At 7:00, Grace came downstairs. She was in her bathrobe, hair wrapped in a towel, face puffy with sleep. She poured coffee without speaking, their morning ritual, the one choreography they'd never lost, 2 bodies moving around a kitchen in a dance refined by 10,000 repetitions. "Turkey smells good," she said. "Pop's recipe? Your dad could cook a bird." She sat across from him, sipped. The kitchen was quiet except for the oven and the clock. "Big day." "Big day," Ken agreed. She looked at him over the rim of her cup, something in her expression, a flicker of what might have been guilt or might have been excitement wearing a mask of guilt. "Ken, I want a day to be nice, whatever happens." He held her gaze. "Whatever happens? I mean family, holidays, things can get tense." "Rachel's been weird lately. Vicky's stressed. I just want everyone to have a good time." Whatever happens, she was rehearsing, laying groundwork, building in advance the defense she'd need when the table erupted. "I said I wanted it to be nice. I tried, a preemptive alibi for the emotional grenade she was about to throw. "It'll be fine," Ken said. "I made enough food for an army." "Anna's bringing her casserole. Steve's got his sweet potatoes. We'll eat. We'll be thankful." He smiled. "Simple." Grace studied him for a moment longer. Whatever she was looking for, she either found it or convinced herself she had, because she nodded, finished her coffee, and went upstairs to start the 3-hour transformation from bathrobe Grace to burgundy dress Grace. Ken sat with his empty cup. The cardinal was gone from the fence post. The sky was lighter now, the clouds breaking in places, hints of pale blue showing through like cracks in plaster. At 8:30, his phone buzzed. A text from Victor, 3 words, "Filed, we're live." Ken read it, deleted it, set the phone face down on the table. The turkey sizzled in the oven. The clock ticked on the wall. Somewhere in the house, water was running, Grace in the shower, washing the old life off, dressing for the new one she thought was coming. Ken washed his coffee cup, dried it, placed it in the rack. Anna arrived at 9:15, carrying a glass dish wrapped in aluminum foil and wearing a dark blue dress that Ken had never seen on her. She looked different out of her cafeteria apron, sharper, more deliberate, like a woman who had dressed for court. "The casserole." She handed it to him. "Pierogi, onions are caramelized, not raw. I'm not an animal. Come in, coffee's on." She stepped inside and immediately scanned the dining room with tactical precision. The table, the place settings, the chairs. She counted settings under her breath. 7. His brother's not coming. Good, fewer civilians. She turned to Ken. Her eyes were calm, steady, the eyes of someone who had spent 11 years feeding 300 children a day and had learned that chaos was just a logistics problem. How are you? Ready. No, you're not. Nobody's ready for this, but you're prepared, and that's better. She took off her coat, hung it on the hook by the door. Victor, parked by now, gray Camry, 3 houses east. I'll set out the appetizers. Crackers and that cheese spread from Jewel. Don't make a face. It's fine. Nobody eats appetizers at Thanksgiving anyway. They're just something to hold while you wait for the real food. She moved into the kitchen with the proprietary confidence of a woman who had commandeered larger kitchens under worse conditions. Ken let her. He checked the turkey, golden, the skin tightening, the juices running clear when he pierced the thigh with a fork. 10 more minutes. At 9:40, Grace came downstairs, the burgundy dress. It fit her well, better than anything Ken had seen her wear in years. She'd done her hair, her makeup, her nails. She was wearing earrings he didn't recognize, small gold drops that caught the light. She looked, Ken had to admit, beautiful. Not the beauty of a 25-year-old, the beauty of a 62-year-old woman who had decided after decades of not trying to try. And the trying made it worse because it confirmed everything. You don't dress like that for your family. You don't buy gold earrings for your sister and your daughter. You dress like that for the person you want to impress, the person you're about to introduce as your future. Oh, Anna, you're here early. Grace's smile was warm but slightly confused, the expression of a hostess who hadn't expected the set to be populated before she'd finished rehearsing. Ken invited me. I brought pierogies. Lovely. Grace smoothed the front of her dress. You look nice. So do you, new dress? This old thing, found it in the closet. Anna glanced at Ken, a micro-expression that said, I will not dignify that with a response. Then she went back to arranging crackers on a plate with geometric precision. The doorbell rang at 11:15, Vicky and Jake. Vicky was in a gray sweater and slacks, her teaching salary wardrobe pressed into holiday service. Jake was beside her in a corduroy jacket that had seen better years, holding a bottle of wine. The kind that comes in a paper bag and costs less than a lunch. He looked nervous. Jake always looked nervous, the permanent expression of a man whose freelance income arrived in unpredictable spasms and whose wife's student loans were a recurring character in their marriage. Dad! Vicky hugged him. Her arms were tight. She was checking on him, Ken realized, holding on an extra beat the way she had in the diner parking lot, still worried. Still sensing the tremor beneath the surface without being able to name it. Hey, kiddo, hey, Jake, Mr. O'Sullivan. Jake shook his hand with the overly firm grip of a man who'd read somewhere that handshakes matter. Happy Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving, come in, turkey's resting. They filed into the living room. Grace swept in from the kitchen, arms wide. There's my girl. She hugged Vicky, a performance hug, Ken noted, arms extended, chin over shoulder, the posture of a woman who wanted to be seen embracing her daughter rather than actually embracing her. Mom, you look, wow, new dress. Just something I found. Grace waved a hand. Jake, honey, there's beer in the fridge. Jake nodded gratefully and vanished toward the kitchen with the speed of a man who had learned that the safest place at family gatherings was wherever the alcohol was. Rachel arrived at 11:30. She came through the door with the hunched, reluctant posture of someone entering a room they knew contained a bomb but hadn't been told where it was hidden. She was carrying a store-bought pumpkin pie and wearing an expression of controlled dread. Happy Thanksgiving, she said to no one in particular. Ratch, Grace kissed her sister's cheek. You look tired. I'm always tired, it's my brand. Rachel set the pie on the counter and immediately sought the wine. Her eyes found Ken across the room, held for a second, then dropped, she knew. She still knew, and she still hadn't said a word. Ken checked his watch. 11:45, 15 minutes. At 11:52, the doorbell rang. Grace's head turned toward the sound with the speed of a woman who'd been waiting for it all morning. Her face changed, not dramatically, not obviously, but Ken saw it. A brightness, a lift, the involuntary physical response of a person hearing the arrival of someone they want. The same response Ken hadn't triggered in her in years, maybe decades. I'll get it, she said. She walked to the front door, opened it. And there he was, Steve Wojcik, 42, in a sport coat that didn't fit right across the shoulders and a tie that was knotted too thick. He was carrying a casserole dish covered in foil, the famous sweet potato casserole, marshmallows presumably entombed beneath, and wearing the smile of a man who believed he was walking into a friendly dinner rather than the most carefully planned ambush of his life. "Hey, Gracie." He leaned in and kissed her cheek. At the threshold. In view of the living room where Vicky was mid-sentence and Jake was mid-beer and Rachel was mid-prayer, Vicky stopped talking. "Everyone," Grace said, her voice pitched slightly higher than normal, the register of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "This is Steve Wojcik. He works at the building downtown. I told you about him." She had told no one about him, not in any honest way. But the introduction served its purpose. It brought the man into the house, into the living room, into the space where family happened. "Steve, this is my daughter Vicky, her husband Jake, my sister Rachel, and Anna, Ken's friend from the school." Steve worked the room with the aggressive friendliness of a man overcompensating for the awkwardness of his presence. He shook Jake's hand. Complimented Vicky's sweater, told Rachel she didn't look a day over 50, which made her wince. He nodded at Anna, who nodded back with the warmth of a freezer door. Then he turned to Ken. "Ken, man, finally, Grace talks about you all the time." He extended his hand, thick fingers. A grip that squeezed too hard, the handshake of a man who'd read the same article Jake had but taken it more literally. Ken shook his hand, looked him in the eye, saw a man who was not evil, not calculated, not the villain of a melodrama, just a lonely, short-sighted 42-year-old security guard who had stumbled into something he couldn't handle and was too desperate to let go. "Steve. Welcome, make yourself at home. Thanks, brother, appreciate you having me. Nobody should be alone on Thanksgiving, right?" "Right," Ken said. "Nobody should be alone." He released the handshake, glanced at the clock on the mantel. 11:58. In the kitchen, the turkey rested on its platter, carved and ready. The dining room table gleamed with Margaret O'Sullivan's Noritake china. 7 chairs. 7 settings, 7 people, each carrying a different version of the truth into the same room. Outside, on the street 3 houses east, a gray Camry sat with its engine off and its driver reading a legal brief, a briefcase on the passenger seat. Ken poured himself a glass of water. His hand was steady. "Dinner's ready," he said. "Let's sit down." Noon. The table was set. The turkey was carved. The candles were lit. 2 tapered flames reflected in the crystal, doubling themselves, the way lies double when you stop counting them. 7 chairs. 7 plates of Margaret O'Sullivan's Noritake china. 7 glasses. 7 napkins folded into rectangles because Grace had watched a YouTube video on napkin swans and given up halfway through. The living room smelled like rosemary and butter and the faint chemical sweetness of the candles, and something else underneath all of it. The sharp animal scent of people pretending everything was fine. They were seated. Grace at one end, Ken at the other. The traditional arrangement, husband and wife bookending the family, except the family between them was fracturing in slow motion and only half of them knew it. Vicky sat to Ken's left, Jake beside her. Vicky hadn't touched her wine. She kept adjusting her napkin, smoothing it, folding the corner, smoothing it again. The restless hands of a third-grade teacher whose classroom had gone quiet in a way that meant trouble. Jake had his arm along the back of her chair, not touching her shoulder, just hovering there, the posture of a man ready to catch something falling. Rachel sat across from them, next to an empty chair. She was drinking her wine, steadily. Her eyes moved between Grace and Ken like a spectator at a tennis match who knew the ball was rigged. Anna was beside Ken's right, solid and upright, eating a cracker with the deliberate calm of a woman who had ironed her dress for this specific occasion and intended to get her money's worth. And Steve Wojcik sat next to Grace, in the chair that would normally have been Ken's brother's, wearing the sport coat that pulled across his shoulders and a tie that was knotted too thick and an expression of determined cheerfulness that reminded Ken of a dog who'd been let inside for the first time and wasn't sure which furniture he was allowed to sit on. He'd arrived with the casserole. He'd called Grace Gracie before the door was fully open. He'd shaken Ken's hand and called him brother. He'd complimented the house, the table, the turkey, the candles, a rolling carpet bombing of flattery that landed on everything and stuck to nothing. Now he was telling Jake about the Bears. "I'm telling you, man, Grossman's got the arm. People write him off, but when he's on, he's on." "You watch the Arizona game?" Jake blinked. "I don't really follow." 19 for 26, 2 touchdowns. That's a statement game. That's a guy saying, hey, I belong here. I'm more of a, you a Sox guy? Tell me you're a Sox guy. White Sox, baby, world champs, still feels good. Jake looked at Vicky with the helpless expression of a man being talked at by a wave. Ken watched from the far end of the table. He chewed a cracker. He sipped his water. He observed Steve the way he'd observed 10,000 passengers on Route 62, with the detached, professional attention of someone whose job was to keep things moving and notice when something was about to go sideways. Steve was nervous. The sportsmanship was a mask. His left knee was bouncing under the table. Ken could see the faint tremor in the tablecloth, and he kept touching Grace's arm, quick little brushes, reassurance-seeking, the gesture of a man who needed to confirm she was still on his side. He was in over his head. He knew it. But he was here because Grace had asked him to be, and saying no to Grace was apparently not something Steve Wojcik had learned to do. Grace, meanwhile, was radiant. Not beautiful, radiant. There's a difference. Beautiful is static. Radiant is energy. She was generating light, filling the room with a manic, hostess-mode warmth that touched everyone and convinced no one. She refilled glasses that didn't need refilling. She complimented Anna's casserole 3 times. She laughed at Steve's jokes before he'd finished telling them. She was performing the happiest day of her life, and she was about to make it the worst. Everyone, Grace stood. She picked up her wine glass and tapped it with a fingernail. The crystal rang, a small, clear note that cut through Steve's monologue about Rex Grossman and silenced the table like a bell at the start of a boxing round. Before we eat, I just want to say something. Ken set down his cracker. His hands rested on the table, flat still. I'm thankful this year, really thankful, for family. She looked at Vicky, at Rachel, at Jake. Her eyes skipped over Anna, an outsider unimportant to the narrative Grace was constructing. For this house, for this food, for all of it. She paused, drew a breath, reached down and took Steve's hand. He stood up beside her, a head taller, his sport coat bunching at the shoulders. And I'm thankful for new friends who feel like family. Another pause. The silence in the room was so complete that Ken could hear the candle flames hissing. Everyone, I want you to meet Steve properly. He's not just a friend from work. He's my boyfriend. We've been seeing each other for a few months now, and I wanted you all to know because I don't want to hide anymore. I want to start this next chapter honestly. Honestly. The word hung in the air like smoke. Vicky's fork slipped from her fingers and hit the plate with a sharp porcelain crack. She stared at her mother. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. Rachel closed her eyes. Her hand found her wine glass and gripped it like a railing. Jake's arm dropped from the back of Vicky's chair to her shoulder. A reflex, protective. Anna didn't move. She was watching Ken. Steve stood beside Grace, holding her hand, his free hand hanging at his side, fingers opening and closing. He looked at Ken. For the first time, his cheerful mask slipped, and beneath it was something raw, fear maybe, or the dawning recognition that he was standing in a room full of people who were about to hate him. Ken looked at his wife. At the burgundy dress and the gold earrings and the defiant tilt of her chin. He looked at her hand wrapped around Steve's thick fingers. He looked at his mother's china on the table, the crystal glasses, the candles she'd bought for this moment. She wanted an audience. She'd built a stage, rehearsed her lines, dressed for the part. She thought this was her scene. It wasn't. Ken placed his napkin on the table. He stood, slowly, no urgency, the deliberate pace of a man who had rehearsed this moment too, but quietly in an office above a dim-sum restaurant with a lawyer who believed in systems. Perfect timing, Ken said. His voice was calm, conversational. The voice he'd used to announce stops for 40 years, clear, steady, designed to be heard over engine noise. I'm thankful too, Grace, thankful for clarity. Grace's smile flickered, a microfracture. Ken looked toward the front hallway. He didn't call out. He didn't signal. He simply looked and the front door opened. Because Victor Liang had been watching through the side light window, briefcase in hand, waiting for the one cue they'd agreed on, Ken standing up. Victor walked into the dining room. Gray suit, pressed white shirt, the tie perfectly knotted. He carried his briefcase the way a surgeon carries an instrument tray, level, steady, purposeful. He nodded at the table. His expression was professionally neutral, the face of a man who had delivered bad news in worse rooms than this. Everyone, Ken said. This is Victor Liang, my attorney. Grace's hand released Steve's. It happened involuntarily. the fingers opening, the connection breaking, the way a person lets go of something hot before the brain registers the burn. The divorce papers were filed this morning with the Circuit Court of Cook County, Ken continued. They cite adultery and financial misconduct. They've been signed for 2 days. He paused. He looked at the casserole dish sitting on the sideboard, foil still on, marshmallows hidden beneath. You can serve the papers with the sweet potatoes. For 3 seconds, nobody breathed. Then Grace made a sound, not a word, a sound. A high, compressed exhale like air forced through a cracked pipe. Her hand went to her chest. The wine glass, still in her other hand, tilted. Red wine crawled down the stem and pooled on the white tablecloth, spreading into the linen like a bruise. You're joking. Her voice was a whisper that wanted to be a scream. Kenneth, you're joking. I'm not. Victor stepped forward. He opened the briefcase on the sideboard, 2 clicks, precise, and produced 2 manila envelopes. He placed the first in front of Grace, where her dinner plate waited. He placed the second at Steve's setting. Mrs. O'Sullivan, this is your copy of the dissolution petition. Mr. Wojcik, you've been named as a correspondent. I'd recommend you retain counsel. Steve stared at the envelope like it was a grenade with the pin pulled. His face had gone from red to white in the time it took Victor to cross the room. Retain, what does that mean? It means you need a lawyer, Steve. Victor's voice was patient, a teacher's voice, the kind of patience that costs $200 an hour. Grace, Steve turned to her. What the hell is happening? But Grace wasn't looking at Steve. She was looking at the envelope. Her fingers hovered over it, trembling, and then she snatched it open and pulled out the papers and began reading. And as she read, Ken watched her face undergo a transformation he would remember for the rest of his life. First, confusion. The legal language, dense and clinical, the Latin phrases, the numbered sections. Her eyes scanned, looking for the words she understood. Then, recognition, adultery, financial misconduct, wasteful dissipation of marital assets, respondent's extramarital relationship with Stephen A. Wojcik. Then panic. The house, she said, her head snapped up. The house is premarital asset, Victor said. Inherited by Mr. O'Sullivan from his father in 1989, never jointly titled. It's not part of the marital estate. That's not, you can't, we've lived here for 35 years as a married couple in a house that was never in your name. Victor adjusted his glasses, 1 push measured. It's in the petition, section 4. The pension. Grace was flipping pages now, frantic. I'm entitled to a marital share, yes, reduced given the documented misconduct. The court will determine the exact percentage, but our filing includes evidence of sustained infidelity and approximately $960 in cash withdrawals used to fund the affair. Those are characterized as dissipated assets. Your sole responsibility. 900, that's nothing, that's. It's a pattern, Mrs. O'Sullivan. Judges care about patterns. Grace shoved back from the table. Her chair scraped across the hardwood, a sound like a gasp, and she stood, the petition crumpled in her fist, her burgundy dress catching the candlelight. You did this. She pointed at Ken, her finger shook. You planned this. You sat there and you smiled and you, how long have you been? 6 weeks, Ken said, give or take. 6 weeks. The word cracked in the middle. You've been lying to me for 6 weeks. The irony landed on the room like a brick. Even Rachel, who had been frozen in her chair with her eyes closed, opened them. Mom, Vicky's voice was small, cracked. How long have you been lying? Grace turned to her daughter. And for the first time since she'd stood up with her wine glass and her announcement and her burgundy dress, something in her face collapsed. Not anger, not indignation, something worse. The recognition that the person whose opinion mattered most was looking at her with an expression that wasn't shock or even anger. It was disgust. Vicky, sweetheart, I can explain. You told me Dad was checked out. You told me he didn't care. You sat in my kitchen and you cried and you said he made you feel invisible. Vicky's voice was climbing. Jake's hand was on her arm, steadying. And the whole time you brought him to Thanksgiving, to our family dinner with Grandma's china. I was going to tell you. I was going to explain. Explain what? That you've been sleeping with a security guard in a motel on Cicero Avenue? Vicky's voice broke. Tears came, but she didn't wipe them. She let them fall. Dad showed me nothing. He didn't say a word. He just sat across from me at a diner and looked sad, and I went home and told Jake that maybe Mom was right, maybe Dad was the problem. And the whole time, she couldn't finish. Jake pulled her clothes. She buried her face in his corduroy jacket. Steve, who had been standing paralyzed through all of this, finally moved. He picked up his envelope from the table unopened and held it at his side like a man holding a parking ticket he intended to contest. "I think I should go," he said. Nobody disagreed. He looked at Grace. She didn't look back. He looked at Ken. Ken met his gaze and held it, not with anger, not with triumph, just with the steady, level attention of a man who had seen everything he needed to see. Steve walked to the sideboard. He reached for his casserole dish, hesitated, then left it. He walked through the living room, through the front hall, and out the door. It closed behind him with a soft click that was louder than any slam. The casserole sat on the sideboard, foil still intact. Nobody would ever eat it. Rachel stood. Her chair moved quietly. She went to Grace and put a hand on her sister's arm. "Come on, come sit down." "Don't touch me." Grace pulled away. You all knew, and nobody." She looked around the room. At Victor standing by the sideboard with his briefcase. At Anna still seated, still calm. At Ken standing at the head of the table in his Christmas sweater, hands at his sides. "Nobody warned me," she whispered. "I tried," Rachel said quietly. "You didn't listen." Grace pressed the crumpled petition against her stomach like a wound. She turned and walked down the hallway to the bedroom. The door closed, through it, muffled and distant, the sound of a woman crying in a room she no longer owned. Ken stood in the silence she left behind. The candles were still burning. The turkey was still on its platter, carved and cooling. His mother's china gleamed under the light. He pulled out his chair, sat down, picked up the serving fork. "Dinner's ready," he said. "The turkey is carved. Anyone who wants to stay and eat is welcome at my table." His voice didn't waver. His hand didn't shake. He served himself a slice of breast meat, a spoonful of mashed potatoes, a heap of Anna's pierogi casserole. He placed his napkin in his lap and picked up his fork. Anna was the first to move. She reached for the green beans. Victor, after a moment, pulled out a chair, set his briefcase on the floor, and sat. Jake, one arm still around Vicky, looked at his wife. Vicky pulled back from his jacket. Her face was streaked, her eyes swollen. She looked at Ken. He looked back. He didn't plead. He didn't explain. He just sat at the head of his father's table, eating his father's turkey recipe in his father's house. "I need some air," Vicky said. She stood. Jake stood with her. They walked to the front door, and a moment later Ken heard them on the porch, Vicky's voice rising and falling, arguing with someone, Rachel, who had followed them out. 4 people at a table set for 7. Ken, Anna, Victor, and the ghost of every Thanksgiving that had come before. "Pass the salt," Anna said. Ken passed the salt. They ate. December came in like a fist. The temperature dropped 15 degrees overnight. The first real snow arrived on a Tuesday, dusting the streets of Archer Heights with a thin white layer that made everything look clean and new, which was a lie, because nothing underneath had changed. Grace moved out 3 days after Thanksgiving. She packed 2 suitcases and 4 boxes while Ken was on his bus route, which he suspected was intentional. She'd always been good at choosing moments when she wouldn't have to face the consequences of her choices. Rachel's apartment on Pershing Road absorbed her the way a sponge absorbs water, reluctantly and with visible strain. Ken came home to a house that was lighter by one woman's worth of clothing, toiletries, and the prepaid cell phone that no longer buzzed on the nightstand. She'd taken the crocheted Afghan from the couch. She'd left the crumpled petition on the kitchen table, smoothed flat, with a single word written across the top in her looping cursive. "Bastard." He folded it. Filed it in the garage in a drawer next to Spencer's photographs. Evidence of a life that was ending. Documentation. He was good at documentation. The neighborhood found out fast. Neighborhoods like Archer Heights don't have CNN, they have cafeteria workers and mail carriers and the woman at the dry cleaners who knows which houses get separate electric bills. Anna didn't gossip, she informed. There's a difference. Gossip embellishes. Anna stated facts with the same flat precision she'd used to tell Ken about the gray Taurus. Grace moved out. Ken filed for divorce. There was another man. 3 sentences, clean as a headline. The details filled themselves in the way water fills cracks, naturally, inevitably, following the path of least resistance. By mid-December, the narrative was fixed. Ken O'Sullivan, the quiet bus driver, the man who never bothered anybody, had been betrayed by his wife, and he'd handled it with a dignity that bordered on biblical. Grace's version, that Ken was cold, distant, checked out, didn't gain traction. In a neighborhood where men went to work and came home and fixed things on weekends and didn't complain, checked out wasn't a flaw, it was a job description. Steve Wojcik's life, which had already been listing, capsized entirely. Ken made the call on a Monday, not to Steve, to the Regent Buildings Property Management Company, which contracted the security firm which employed Steve. He didn't identify himself. He didn't need to. He simply mailed a copy of the relevant sections of the petition, the pages naming Stephen A. Wojcik as a correspondent in an adultery case, to the firm's HR department with a typed note, "For your records." Security guards who appear in divorce petitions as the named affair partner are not, as a rule, considered assets to firms that manage corporate office buildings. The background check that should have flagged Steve's child support arrears had apparently missed them. This filing corrected the oversight. Steve was terminated 2 weeks before Christmas. Spencer, who kept tabs because Spencer always kept tabs, reported that Steve had moved back to the month-to-month apartment on Low Avenue, where he was now 3 months behind on rent and 6 months behind on child support, with a contempt hearing in January and no lawyer. Ken received this information over coffee at the Dunkin' Donuts on Pulaski. He listened. He nodded. He felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. "You want me to keep watching him?" Spencer asked. "No, we're done." Spencer shrugged, finished his coffee, shook Ken's hand with the businesslike grip of a man closing a file. "Take care of yourself, Ken." "I will." He drove home. The streets were salted and gray. Christmas lights were going up on porches along Archer Avenue, colored bulbs, inflatables, the occasional tasteful wreath. Ken's house had no decorations. It hadn't had Christmas decorations since Vicky stopped coming home for the holiday, which was, he counted, 4 years ago. The divorce proceedings moved with the grim efficiency of a machine that had been well-oiled in advance. Victor handled everything. Grace, operating from Rachel's cramped apartment with no savings and no legal counsel beyond a free consultation from a lawyer she'd found in the yellow pages, had no leverage and limited options. The free consultation lawyer took one look at Victor's filing, the photographs, the financial documentation, the timeline of misconduct, and reportedly told Grace that fighting it would cost more than accepting it. She accepted. The terms were close to what Victor had outlined in his office weeks ago. The house remained Ken's. The pension was divided, but Grace's share was reduced by 12%, a judicial acknowledgement of the misconduct. Small in percentage but significant in monthly dollars. She was responsible for her own legal fees and for the dissipated cash withdrawals. The personal property was split along predictable lines. She got the furniture she'd brought into the marriage, the kitchen items she claimed were hers, and the crocheted Afghan she'd already taken. Ken kept his mother's china, his father's tools, and the dining room set. The final decree arrived in February. A single document. 2 signatures. 35 years, dissolved into paragraphs and notarizations. Ken read it at the kitchen table, in the same chair where he'd balanced the checkbook on the Tuesday that started everything. He read it once slowly, the way you read an obituary for someone you loved but hadn't spoken to in years. Then he folded it, placed it in the filing drawer in the garage, and closed the drawer. The house was different now. Not different in the physical sense. The walls were the same, the rooms were the same, the furnace still kicked on at the same temperature, and the kitchen faucet still dripped its slow, patient drip. But the weight had shifted. Rooms that had felt crowded with silence now felt simply empty, and empty, Ken discovered, was not the same as silent. Empty had potential. Silent was a verdict. Empty was a question. He started with the toolbox. His father's red metal toolbox, dented at the corners, latch stiff. He'd been meaning to refinish it for years, one of those projects that lived on the someday list, permanently deferred because there was always something more immediate to do. Fix the porch railing, replace the weather stripping, drive the bus. Balance the checkbook, maintain the marriage, keep the schedule. Now there was no schedule. There was just time stretching out in all directions, and Ken filled it the only way he knew how, with his hands. He sanded the rust, primed the metal, repainted it the same red because some things should stay what they are. He oiled the hinges. Replaced the latch with one from the hardware store on Kedzie, fitted by hand, adjusted until it caught with a clean, satisfying click. The toolbox sat on the workbench, fresh and bright, and Ken looked at it and felt something he hadn't expected. Not pride, not grief, something quieter than both. The sense of a thing returned to its proper condition. He left the photo of his parents inside. Patrick and Margaret circa 1958, young, smiling, standing in front of this house. The letter from Vicky arrived on a Thursday. Plain white envelope, handwritten address. No return address, but he recognized the handwriting. The same loopy script she'd had since grade school, never fully matured into an adult hand, still carrying the rounded vowels of a child who'd learned to write on wide-ruled paper. He opened it at the kitchen table. "Dad, I'm not ready to talk about Thanksgiving yet. I don't know if I'm angry at you or at Mom or at both of you or at myself for not seeing it. I think it's all of those. Jake says I should give it time. Jake says a lot of things. He's good at saying things, not always good at the other parts. I've been thinking about my own marriage, about what's real and what's routine, about whether going through the motions is the same as being present. Jake and I don't fight, we never fight, and I'm starting to think that might be worse than fighting. Can we talk? Not about the divorce, not about Mom, just talk, the way we used to before everything got complicated." Your daughter, Vicky Ken, read the letter twice. He folded it carefully and placed it on the table. Then he picked up the phone and dialed her number. She answered on the second ring. "Dad, hey kiddo, you free Saturday? There's a Cubs thing at Wrigley Winter Fan Fest or some nonsense. Thought we could go freeze together." A pause. He heard her breathe, heard something that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob compressed into a single exhale. "Yeah," she said. "Yeah, I'd like that. Dress warm." "That wind off the lake doesn't care about your feelings." She laughed. A real one this time, small but real. He hung up. He sat at the table with the letter and the late afternoon light coming through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the linoleum, and he thought about what Vicky had written. Whether going through the motions is the same as being present. It wasn't. He knew that now. He'd spent 35 years proving it. But presence without purpose was just attendance, and Ken O'Sullivan was done just showing up. Spring came to Chicago the way it always does, grudgingly, in fits and starts, like a man paying off a debt he resents. March was gray. April was wet. Then one morning in early May, the wind shifted south. The temperature hit 62, and the trees along Archer Avenue exploded into green as if they'd been waiting for permission. Ken drove his school bus. Route hadn't changed. Same streets, same corners, same crossing guard, dolers, still in her fluorescent vest, still treating every intersection like a personal battlefield. The kids piled on at 7:15 and piled off at 3:30, and in between, Ken navigated the streets of Archer Heights with the mechanical calm of a man who had finally found the right speed for his life. Mr. Ken, Tyler says Venus is bigger than Earth, and I said no way. Venus is about the same size, actually, little smaller. Ha, Tyler, you're wrong. I said he was close, not wrong. There's a difference. The kids didn't know about the divorce. They didn't know about Thanksgiving, about the motel on Cicero, about the burgundy dress and the sweet potato casserole. They knew that Mr. Ken drove the bus and answered their questions and never yelled and always waited if someone was running late. That was enough. At 65, Ken had learned that being enough was underrated. Coffee with Anna happened on Wednesdays now. A standing appointment, unspoken, the way all real commitments are, not scheduled, just understood. They met at a diner on Archer that wasn't Dempsey's because Dempsey's carried too many ghosts, and they sat in a booth by the window and talked about things that didn't require excavation. "Danny called last night." Anna stirred her coffee. Her son Daniel was 26 Army, stationed at Fort Hood. She mentioned him the way she mentioned everything, factually, without decoration, but with a tenderness underneath that you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. "He's re-enlisting. Good for him or bad for him? Good for his career, bad for my nerves. He says they might deploy again. He doesn't say where, I don't ask." Smart. "It's not smart, it's survival. You don't ask questions you can't handle the answers to." She looked at him over her coffee. "How's the house? Painted the bedroom. Finally, that blue Grace picked in '94 is gone. Went with a gray, warm gray. The guy at the hardware store called it grayish. I told him to stop making up words." Anna almost smiled. "And Vicky? Better. We went to the Fan Fest. Froze our tails off. She bought a hat with a bear on it and wore it the whole way home." He paused. She's talking to Jake about things, real things, not just mortgage things. I think seeing what happened to us scared her enough to start paying attention. Good, fear's useful if you point it in the right direction. They drank their coffee. Outside, a school bus passed, not Ken's, a different route, and he watched it go with the proprietary attention of a man who knew exactly how that driver was feeling at 10:15 on a Wednesday morning. Tired, focused, responsible for cargo more valuable than he was paid to protect. "You hear about Grace?" Anna asked. He had. The neighborhood kept him informed whether he wanted it or not. Grace had taken a full-time cashier position at a grocery store in Berwyn, not Jewel Osco, a different chain, a fresh start in a suburb where nobody knew her name or her story. She was renting a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat which struck Ken as grimly symmetrical given Spencer's office. She was, by all accounts, functional, working, surviving. "I heard," Ken said. "You feel anything?" He thought about it, genuinely considered the question the way Anna deserved for asking it. "Pity," he said, "distant, like seeing a car broken down on the side of the road. You feel bad, but you keep driving." Anna nodded. "That's about right." They finished their coffee, split the check, walked to the parking lot. Anna headed to her car, a beige Corolla that was older than most of the kids Ken drove, and Ken headed to his truck. "Ken." He turned. Anna stood by her car, keys in hand, squinting against the May sun. "You did the right thing, in case nobody's said that to you lately. You did the right thing, and you did it the right way, and you're going to be fine." He nodded. "Thanks, Anna. Don't thank me. Just keep painting rooms. That blue was terrible." She got in her car. He got in his truck. They drove in separate directions, toward separate lives, connected by a Wednesday morning routine that neither of them needed to name to know it mattered. A Saturday in May. Ken drove to Michigan, not far. 2 hours, maybe less, east on I-94 and then north along the lakeshore, the road narrowing as the suburbs gave way to beach towns and dune grass and the flat, blue expanse of Lake Michigan stretching to the horizon like an empty page. He parked at a public beach near St. Joseph, walked to the pier. The wood was weathered silver gray, the planks slightly warped from seasons of ice and sun. He walked to the end and sat down, legs hanging over the edge, the water 15 feet below, green and cold and constantly moving. Nobody was here. A weekday off-season, too early for the summer crowds. Just Ken and the lake and a few seagulls arguing over a piece of bread someone had left on the rocks. He sat there for a long time, an hour, maybe more. He didn't think about Grace. He didn't think about Steve or Victor or the petition or the photographs or the motel on Cicero Avenue. He thought about nothing. He watched the water. He listened to it slap against the pilings. He felt the sun on his face, weak spring sun, the kind that promises more than it delivers, but a promise is still a promise. For the first time in decades, his time was his own. No route, no schedule. No departure time, no arrival time, no passenger count, just a man on a pier watching the water move. He drove home at 4 in the afternoon. The highway was empty. The radio played something he didn't recognize, new music, young music, a woman singing about starting over. He didn't change the station. Sunday evening. The garage. The toolbox sat on the workbench, finished. Red paint, new latch, old hinges. The photo of his parents still inside, Patrick and Margaret, 1958, young and unaware of everything that was coming. Ken reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a second photograph. This one was recent, taken at the Cubs Fan Fest, mid-January, Vicky's phone. Ken and Vicky, side by side, bundled in coats, breath visible in the cold air. Vicky was wearing the bear hat. Ken was wearing the expression of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to stand next to his daughter and not be carrying a secret. They were both smiling, not the practiced smile of a holiday photo, the real thing. The kind of smile that happens when two people who almost lost each other decide not to. He placed the photo inside the toolbox next to his parents. 2 generations, 2 versions of survival, one faded, one fresh. He closed the lid, the new latch caught with a clean click. He walked inside, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table. The faucet dripped its patient drip. The furnace hummed, the clock ticked. The house was quiet. For the first time, the quiet felt like his own.